Okay, punks, it's time to get real, talk rough, and talk tough, and confront our anxieties about Warhammer the Old World, and our fears of where it could all go terribly wrong. To do so, I am joined by an individual who is as much a force as a man, of muscularity, barbarians, endless humorous yet insightful analysis, and still his hero quest ballad reverberates throughout the lands. But of course, in reality, the best thing about Hero Quest is the very man for whom I speak, and I speak, of course, of none other than the BARD. Hail, BARD!
Hail, Dr. Blacksall. What a cracking day for a moan, this day of omens where the stars have twisted into the complaining configuration, and I'm here in my complaining chair with the thumping pads. I've got my Bugman's ale, although I think there's something wrong with it. The Engineers Guild must have worked on this one. Never mind that. I've got my emergency backup brew right here.
Right, well, indeed, that's splendid for a lot of moaning there's going to be. And I should say something about what that moaning will be. It will be of the kind of a high-level kind of moan, where we go back and forth and discuss some of our concerns. Then we'll have a look together at some of the art and some of the models that we've seen. Maybe a moan isn't quite your cup of tea. Maybe you prefer low sugar, low caffeine, low tar variants that you might get from some Games Workshop. Well, you ain't getting it here. Anyway, because this is my video, I get to do the first moan. And my first moan is going to all be about the rules. Now, Warhammer Fantasy has been a long, complicated kind of game that has had many editions. These editions have had hundreds of pages of rules. They take a long time to learn. Are they going to simplify them? Are they going to make them all a bit bland and a bit vanilla? When Age of Sigmar dropped, about 200 pages of rules were reduced to 4 pages. And that really gave me the heebie-jeebies. But really what I think is that they're going to have to go one of two ways to make a game that they think should be super playable and in tournament settings. One, they make it very, very simplistic, so there could be no arguments about it. Or second, they produce very, very complicated rules with far more erratas than they ever did before. Or the third option, which I don't think they'll do, is to go back to a more gentlemanly orientated kind of game, where players are trusted to come to constructive disagreements with each other and to make house rules. I don't think they're likely to go down that route, however. What do you think, BARD?
I agree with you. I agree they're not very likely to go down that route at all. Tournaments, and especially streamed tournaments, from what I've seen, have become rather important to Warhammer and certain portions of the fan base, perhaps. And I don't see too many of them myself, but for that sort of thing to function, you have to have some sort of level of clarity in the rules and ease of judgment for when there is a dispute. So you have to be able to make a call, and quick, because as you've certainly experienced, time can be a deadly factor in tournament play. But for the ordinary player at home, that can be an awful lodestone around your neck. Some of these rules that, for maybe players who don't know better and aren't that experienced, who don't know that they can change things to their benefit, who perhaps take the rules at face value and don't know that they can override it with their own imaginations and their own desires of what they want to get out of the game. Maybe that can be a problem. It can be difficult for rules to serve two masters.
Yes, so, I think so. And after, I suppose, one of the masters walked out the door, which he did with Age of Sigmar, I suppose only the fans were left. And one of the quite agreeable things about that rather deserted island that there was, although there weren't many people left on it, was that then, because the master had gone, we had no choice but to become our own masters and make up our own rules, and thus we had the initiative. Will that happen anymore when the master is back in control, when dictator-like orders are being disseminated from the central tower? Maybe we will be in sad, grey subservience to what comes out from Games Workshop and not be able to think for ourselves.
Maybe, but only if you want that, and only if they can succeed in capturing you. And if they do, then if they can capture you, like you in particular, if Games Workshop by some miracle can appeal to you in particular, well, then we'll see that the game they release will be something to behold. But I don't think they will, because we're getting our Grumbles in now already. We can sense on the wind that things aren't quite being made for us, so to speak. The older heads who like the older ways, perhaps, maybe to a fault. But I think we can sense it coming in the breeze. You know, it seems fairly clear.
And this is where age can matter, I suppose, and where, you know, the way things used to be cast a long shadow. We were talking before we began this moan about things like guessing artillery ranges and the nuances of all that kind of thing, which even in 8th edition was got rid of by pre-measuring. And there are various other things that I rather liked about the past, like the card-driven magic system and all of this. And so, you know, I sense that there are probably some modern aspects afoot that may make the game something that is, well, for the new generation, which, to be fair, perhaps is what it should be. But I do feel being somewhat left in the lurch by modern developments.
I think you can probably expect cards to return. Cards are currently pretty trendy in modern games. I think look, I don't really like card-driven things, all right, except for games that are card games at heart. I don't like cards bolted onto to other games and other systems. So I think you might be in luck there.
But you mentioned guessing ranges earlier, Bard. That's something that you rather like.
I like guessing ranges. Yes, it's exciting and adds a little bit of drama. Guessing charge ranges, artillery ranges, this sort of thing adds what I think is very valuable, and that's an extra bit of tension. Now, maybe that's not compatible with your organized tournaments and things like that, but it's very compatible with having a laugh in your house with your friends or down the gaming hall in a casual and relaxed atmosphere. When it starts, when you get close to the line and you see if your guess is right and the tape measure comes out and it's fractions of a millimeter, that's pretty exciting. You see if you were correct or false, true or false, where your heart truly lies.
But that binary may not be so much there, because both players may think that it is true and both may think that it is false, i.e. that it is just within 12 inches or just outside. But perhaps that essential ambiguity reflects something more generally about gaming and indeed life.
Maybe. Well, that's where the gentleman's game you mentioned earlier comes in, trusting the players to be gentlemen and come to their own conclusions about the rules and the scenarios and other things like that, that one fears somewhat that Games Workshop has already demonstrated a little bit of a dictatorial twinge of control over, so to speak. But I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure what will happen. Maybe so.
Yes, maybe I think one thing you touched upon there, Bard, was, I suppose, the kind of divide between what one might call the sort of tournament kind of player base and, you know, those who are in a club and the sort of casual players who are 99% of the overall whole. But of course, because the tournament players, you know, have the most incisive evidence-based kind of critique to make of rules, and because perhaps they end up getting maybe a lot closer to Games Workshop for all sorts of different reasons, partly because some of the playtesters are maybe part of maybe that tournament crowd or were part of them, that there's always maybe a fear that there's a push of a game towards more of a group of tournament players, even though they represent a kind of a disproportionate minority. And one might end up with a game which might be technically really quite sophisticated and playable in a tournament setting, but is potentially very complicated and off-putting to mortal men. And striking a balance between those communities, albeit one that's larger than the other, is a historic challenge.
Complexity. Look, let's talk about that for a moment. Like, is complexity worth chasing on its own? Like, is it worth something of its own merit? And I've sort of changed my mind on this recently. If we'd had this discussion like a year or two ago, I'd have said complexity should be avoided as much as you can. And what you actually want is depth and nuance. But these days, I think complexity is really an effect of having those two things. When you're designing a game, I feel, and you're making the decisions that you truly think are right, you can wind up with a certain amount of complexity. And complexity is not a particularly good thing for its own merits. If you're just making rules to be complex, like our game isn't complex enough, it's not going to appeal to the really gamist sort of players, to raise the specter of the old what's it called? The old big model, the three temperaments of role player from back in the ancient theoretical times. Yes. You're not going to. You can appeal to them, but it's not going to have substance behind it. There has the rules, the complexity in the rules has to reflect an idea first. See, there's these two forces I feel in game design. War game design is included, but in role-playing games as well. There's the imagination and there's the mechanization, like the rules. And they're like this, okay? You can't have just one of them. There's both, and they're in constant tension. They're like two furies. And if you actually have balance between them, that's no good. That's not going to appeal to anybody. They have to go one way or the other. War games naturally pull towards mechanization because they're not really so much games of the imagination like role-playing games might be. Yeah. Role-playing games have been struggling like this. You know, they pull this way and then they go that way, and individual games go one way and the others. War games have always been a lot more mechanized and ruly than others. Warhammer is sort of an exception to things like historical games and games based on myths and lore and the like in the elder times of when Peter Cushing was playing his games back in the older times, and before that in the 1800s, the really early war games, because it has a fantasy element, and the way it was presented originally and throughout the 80s and 90s and even up to today has had a really strong imaginative connection to it that invites the player's imaginations quite strongly, although I'd argue less strongly these days.
I think that the technicality point that you make there can also be seen with Warhammer without any question over time, in that if you look at, say, 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, there's no question that it is technically much more sort of accomplished, or a much more sort of honed kind of technical product that has less ambiguities in it for all sorts of reasons than in former editions, where it was impossible to play without gentlemanly agreement. In a sense, the shift away from 4th and 5th edition to 6th edition was as much a revolution of technicality, was having a technical rule set which really could be played, I think, competitively for the first time in a way that was quite difficult with former rule sets. And then 7th edition and certainly 8th edition continued that. And of course, then a fan crowd of 9th edition players then went and took the kind of technical rewiring to the next degree and produced, a specimen of such mechanical precision and efficiency that was something that Games Workshop could never have produced. But I suppose, is there therefore always a kind of an infinite gravitational force towards the ever more technical? Because I think that Games Workshop might try and resist that, because they know on face value that might just get a bit off-putting.
I don't think there is an infinite. I think there's trends. Okay, there's tides. Okay, the coming and going of the tide, and I think a shift of perspective is probably all that's required at some level within Games Workshop to change things to go back the other way. At the moment, if you look at games broadly, things like esports were very popular for a while there. And when I look at these 40K tournaments and things online, I think this looks like an esport. And there's like, they don't look anything imaginative at all. It's boring terrain, super symmetrical, objective markers with like the tournament name or the sponsor name on it facing the camera and that sort of thing, completely sterile imaginatively. But I'm sure it's fine competitively for competitive players, the real gamists, right, who enjoy that sort of mechanical crunch and solving the problem that is the opposing army with the tools you've got. It's pretty exciting, it can be. But without the bedrock of imagination, it's not that appealing to me. But I think there is definite possibility for swinging back the other way. And we see it already and have for a long time, particularly in the market for skirmish games. A lot of those lean heavily on the imagination. Otherworld Miniatures produced one. I can't remember the name. It might have just been called Otherworld game, which really, it evoked the old D&D aesthetics and sensibility and really wanted you to engage imaginatively with it a little more. If I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I've looked at that rule book, actually. But so there's always the possibility of going back to the ancient days of the battle reports that were heavily scenario based, that weren't strictly based on army lists, that maybe this dwarf army has an elven scout in it, maybe leading them through a forest, or something like that. And they play out the scenario and see what happens. That's more of a simulationist thing, since I've got that in my mind, the big model, the what is it called? The threefold model of old. I don't know why that's come up suddenly. That's like the simulation.
Okay.
That's more my stuff.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, so I think there is probably a capacity for all that there, but ultimately I think that there's probably a general view, I think, amongst the sort of Warhammer fans that Warhammer kind of, in a sense, got to maybe a little bit too complicated, maybe wasn't written, I suppose, clearly enough, and put off, I suppose, a certain number of fans, and this was why it became, I suppose, a sort of a niche product. Now, one thing I do think about the nature of the old world, though, specifically when you think about it, is I don't think GW, for various reasons maybe we'll cover, are trying to make this perhaps a mass market game in the same way. I think there are enough indications in some of the visuals, some of the fact that they're reusing all these old models, and the fact that they've kind of really released this news very kind of slowly, that this might be what you might call a little bit of a budget kind of boutique product, that we're not being sold like, this is a new gaming system, like the equivalent of 40K, as of course fantasy historically was. And if it is in that boutique-y kind of a niche, then perhaps they don't need to go chasing a kind of a mass player base in the kind of same way. And so it can maybe be as complicated as it needs to be without necessarily, feeling as though it's putting off like a huge number of players.
Maybe, but if it's excessively mechanized and serves only the mechanic, then I'm probably not going to like it very much. Because, in games, the idea of balance has become fetishized to the point where it basically works against itself. Like, where appearing balanced is more important than actually being balanced, and I see this in D&D over the last 20 years. It's got more and more like that. But I don't know. Like, it's completely possible that it could become. Actually, I think there's very strong evidence that it is a niche, a niche thing, because even though we learned recently that we're really quite close to release, what we've seen from like the art department and the like is nothing like I would have expected for something that they were really backing. Now, obviously, as a product from a big company, it has to be somewhat successful. But as I think you alluded to earlier, the Warhammer fan base is broken up into these little cults, right? These cabals. Some of them favor this edition, some of them favor that edition. Like the strongest holdouts seem to be like third or fourth, sixth, and eighth, and the strange emergent cult of the ninth. And there's a few others. So which of those are they going to appeal to? Because they're not these cults for no reason. They're quite strong in what they like. And where Games Workshop tries to appeal will be quite telling. Is it going to choose the biggest group of those, the eighth guys, maybe? I would suggest from the artwork, as we'll see later, that yes, that's probably what they're trying to do, because it's so reiterative. The artwork that they've released is almost like a Terminator sequel. It's like you remember this, it's the same. Remember this, it's the same.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit
it almost
like
feels like it, but as you say, like a kind of a remake. But this is I find this quite fascinating though, Bard, really, because okay, so in terms of the 8th edition players that are kind of stood around, like after the game was blown up in 2015, we're talking about a really tiny number of people. So in the UK, where we have a big population, we're probably the most per head of population, the most wargamery out of any population in the world, I would wager. There are probably 250, 300 8th edition players that are active in the UK. This is really a very, very tiny number compared to, presumably, even if it is a niche product, the kind who would immediately appear, people who have, say, played Total War series, who really like the fluff and the lore of Warhammer Fantasy, who are going to be coming in. And so I'm interested that they seem to be paying a lot of attention to those kind of cabals, as you put them, especially the 8th Ed cabal, in making those very strongly reiterative kind of images that are almost designed to kind of not warriors. They're designed to almost be, sort of celebrations of tradition in a certain, maybe even quite uninspired way. So they seem to think that perhaps we're more important than I think that we actually are. We make a lot of noise on the internet. Perhaps that's why they're worried about us. But apart from that, I think we've made a very, very good fist of perhaps making ourselves seem more important than we actually are. So they listen to a voice that's actually not really very loud in reality.
You made a really interesting point that I actually have spoken about with friends of mine in the past about the timing of some of those Warhammer fantasy based computer games very important, because it was after the end times when they discarded the old lore and salted the earth, so to speak. They ruined it. That's a whole other discussion. Never mind that. But those computer games came out and they proved that there was real appeal and real life, not just in those games as games unto themselves, like Total War, obviously popular, but in the lore and in the character of Warhammer Fantasy itself. That appeals. It really does. It has life. The Total War game is, of course, the big one, but Vermintide is another excellent representation of the Warhammer world in the digital, in a computer game form specifically. And there's others that aren't quite as prominent as those. So there's probably a secret other cult underneath the actual Warhammer players that is bigger than all of them, and it's the curious refugees from the computer world who wonder about this game. Warhammer, what's that? I'll play it. I'll look it up. Oh, it doesn't exist anymore. And they don't go to Age of Sigmar because it's not as appealing, perhaps, to people who have been warmed up by a dose of old Warhammer fantasy lore, even though it is late period lore, which I don't like as much.
I mean, they made a rod for their own back there in that regard, because I mean, the whole point of Age of Sigmar was to make it, to differentiate it from, first of all, the look and feel of a mass rank and flank combat game, which Total War sort of is in its own conception, and of course to have all sorts of kind of new units with kind of new names and a lore which obviously didn't take place on this world, which took place in the mortal realms after its explosion and all the rest of it. So I can completely understand someone who likes Total War, who likes any of the lore in it, or who likes even the nature of what Total War battles kind of feel like in terms of grand maneuver, not feeling a particular appeal to Age of Sigmar really any more even than they would 40k. And so I think what we can conclude from this is that because the developers of Total War took the decision to not turn their back on the old world over several releases, despite, I think, some encouragement from Games Workshop to try to switch to the Age of Sigmar universe, suggests that Games Workshop made a catastrophic error in trying to ditch the lore of Warhammer Fantasy. Now, that's quite a different debate, I think, to the error about ending it as a game. I still think that was a mistake too, but I think that the arguments are a bit more finely balanced there. But as a lore, as an intellectual property, insofar as it could be, IP'd and defended, to discard that was really very swiftly vetoed by a quite canny kind of market, which helped produce very, very successful games. And maybe, as you say, their own kind of cult, which is the much, much larger one, who's going to be the real audience of this. And so perhaps those pictures that we're going to look at later, and that quite conservative kind of feel they seem to have gone for, is to appeal to those Total War people, to say, hey, this is the old world.
Yeah, maybe so. Well, it's no replacement even as a game. Like the Age of Sigmar, I'm not mad at Age of Sigmar. I can actually recognize that Age of Sigmar is a perfectly fine and playable game. It doesn't appeal to me on an imaginative sort of level. So, there's been a couple of times where I thought about getting into it and I've conceptualized the kind of factions that I play, but there's always something else. It's very hard for me to like that game in a fictive sense, in an imaginative sense, which is how I engage with these things primarily anyway. But I recognize it's a fine game, but it's no replacement for the grand maneuver, as you say, rank and flank of Warhammer. And all it takes is to watch a game of that on YouTube, 6th edition, 8th edition, whatever, to see that it's a completely different character of game that has a different pace, different style of play, different approach. The way you play it is completely different. The way you think about it is different. And the way it resolves itself mechanically is also completely different and a little more exciting, if you ask me. But that might be a whole other matter.
I mean, even the switch from square to round bases is of such significance because, of course, maneuverability, arc of sight becomes absolutely, pivotal to the whole way a game is played. I mean, one thing on a very basic aesthetic level I've always loved about Warhammer Fantasy and other rank and flank games is you can just pass by a table of it being played and the game situation will immediately become obvious to you. Whereas I find with Age of Sigmar and 40k, I don't, and that's partly because I'm ignorant of the game, but where the models are on the table relative to others doesn't really seem to give such a clear indication, of who's winning, apart from the models, I guess, that aren't on the table. But of course, they might not be dead. They might be involved in some kind of deep strike or something like that. So even then, you're not able to really tell.
Well, you can still do that in fantasy, though. Reinforcements can come from wild edges, and miners can burrow up from odd angles. If I recall
that's true. That's a bit of a rejoinder there. Demons summoned from beyond on a 2d6, double six on the Realm of Chaos table. Yes, models can be put on the table, and that's nothing to say nothing of necromancers. Yes,
but it is clever. It also had I don't know if they do this anymore, but early Age of Sigmar rejected measuring base to base, which was so weird. It was part of model to part of model, which was, I think, playing a dangerous guy. I don't think they do that anymore in the more recent revisions. I haven't really kept up with it.
Yeah, I mean, there are things like that are vague. I mean, there's also even true line of sight as well, but that's a hangover from older editions of fantasy. Whether they'll get rid of that or not, I don't know. So to actually say, go down to the level of your artillery piece and look and see, I'm going to see through the eyes of my, dwarf cannon crew. Can I see that dragon behind the hill over there? Or can I just see the top of its wing? Would it be reasonable to infer that a dwarf in this particular context, when he had probably heard that the enemy had a two-headed chaos dragon in its army, to think, what might be there? Is it a legitimate target or not? So there are those kind of vagaries. And so they've always been there, I suppose.
A little bit of abstraction's inevitable in miniatures games.
Yes, I mean, I think this sort of segues really into another one of the moans that I was going to have, which I suppose we make now, is how far they're going to go for modernity and how far they're going to respect history. Now, I mean, it seems to me that one thing I initially feared was I thought, it's going to go all Age of Sigmar. You're going to have to be a demigod to get into the phone directory. There's going to be no place for a dwarven thane down his mine, or a night goblin big boss with his boys. You're going to have to be one of those sorts of magical elemental types that appeared in the end times, who's got, gods on speed dial. So it might be a bit like that, or it might go the other way, which is to kind of shackle itself into a sort of, a kind of an acquiescence to an old kind of historical idea, which I think would be better than the first thing. Don't get me wrong about that. I'd rather have a reheated version that's not as nice of something that was very nice a long time ago rather than a dog's dinner. But I'm not sure which way they're going to quite go, and whether they will resist the allure of going all new hammer.
Well, they've already got the ultimate new hammer in Age of Sigmar, and it would be redundant for them to go for that again. And I think what they've shown us is that they're going for grounding. Because the images, as we'll see later, that they choose to show weren't chosen without intent behind them. Then it seems like they're going for groundedness and a step back into maybe even pre-8th edition ideas of power. We'll see. However, it's a little concerning that they've already made such an effort to also reinforce a certain personality on the Bretonnian army with going for a particular color scheme, and they've given it a name. It belongs to a certain duke or baron. I don't remember exactly the name. So that's kind of also a little bit of a bell. Is it going to be something like War Machine was, where it actually revolves around specific characters? And that's one of my moans, is if it's going to follow a canonized narrative or something like that, or is it going to leave the background be background? I guess we'll get to that moan later. But in general, I think what they've shown suggests that they're going toward the more grounded and I think more appealing stuff, rather than the demigod, ultimate heroes sort of ultra high fantasy sort of setting that they're.
I think though, there's one thing that comes on from that is, I think if you're going to use history though, I think you've got to use it quite well. And you can read the history and you can understand what they were doing and then just simply repeat it. That's not as interesting as using history to inspire you to create kind of other things. And I think that they might be a little kind of gun shy of frightening the very many angry horses that are about. And so therefore they may not use the history as a springboard for something better and make their own generational imprint on it. They may just repeat it or rehash it. And there's a certain danger in that.
They've got a golden chance, like to have a new interpretation of what was good, retain what was really good, and and have a new vision of it, reborn, and not exactly like of old, but something new, which carries the best qualities of what I think you and I like. And to talk about did they mention they were simplifying the magic system? I think I heard that somewhere.
They did mention that, yes.
I had a thought about that specifically, because this takes place well in the past from the Warhammer that we're used to. It takes place in a pre-collegiate era, before the colleges of magic existed. So Warhammer is empire-centric. Everything's relative to the empire, and that's kind of why you're stuck. No matter what army you play, with these 8 colors of magic, because that's the 8 colleges of magic that were founded by Teclis 200 years ago. Well, beyond that era, things were a little wild. The reason he founded those colleges was to get the humans under control a little bit, who could do magic, but they were a little bit cowboy with their powers. So we might see a reconfiguration of the magic system. You might see fewer so-called laws. You might see different things. And the reason I thought of this is because of this classic book here, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the first edition.
Oh, yes.
You don't have Bright Wizard. You can't be Bright Wizard. You don't go for the Bright Lore or the Celestial Lore or the Lore of Beasts or anything like that. You're a mage, a wizard, proper terminology. Yes. And at a certain point, you can become one of, I think, 5. Demonologist, Necromancer, those are the evil ones. Alchemist is also a base class, actually. Elementalist, Illusionist, and there's another one. I don't remember what it is.
Alas, me neither. Although I remember when the wizard in my Woofrup group learned the fireball spell, he went from rubbish to artillery almost immediately.
Disaster. But so you might get a new approach to magic that might be a little simpler, but not necessarily less nuanced or not relevant to the world that was pre-collegiate, pre-3rd edition, whenever that started. That might be actually post-3rd edition. I don't know what was going on in 3rd edition. I think of it. So you might find that.
I think in 3rd ed, my understanding of that is that there are a lot more sort of generic spells that many different kind of wizards can learn, although specialism is required to do like necromantic kind of spells. But as an opportunity there, in a sense, I have to say I quite like the colleges of magic personally as a part of the lore. I also think it's quite interesting that that's the way in which humans were sort of permitted to kind of interact through magic through the elves, and they split it in this way, and then they had this kind of collegiate system. But I think that generally moving the timeline backwards does give them some kind of opportunities to do some things that are quite different. As we mentioned, kind of opportunities, and rethinking magic might be one. Now, personally, I think that magic is one of the areas, or at least the empire magic, which I already quite like. And that's, of course, one of the intrinsic issues there, in that one always wants to be conservative about the things one really likes, but one's very keen to be very liberal amongst the things one doesn't really care about. And different people will have different takes on all those sorts of things. But there are many opportunities, this is perfectly true, to make something that has its own kind of generational kind of imprint, that leans upon some older influences, but also some kind of newer kind of ideas about the aesthetic of fantasy or whatever it might be, that aren't preferably taking it outside of the thematic constellation of the old world. And if they are just simply, I suppose, subdued into subservience of repeating the ancient instructions or deciphering the great history chiseled on tablets of stones of old, all they may create is a poor facsimile of the original.
Maybe. Well, this was 1986, right? And this was drawn.
Yes,
from the
golden era.
The editions of that day, and it was a lot looser. That was cowboy times. This has gnomes in it. You mentioned Warhammer gnomes to people now, they'd say, well, what are you talking about? But they were a thing, not necessarily canonized, but they're in here. So they've got a chance to reach into this soup of ancient chaos and pull out the hair of Kalis and forge it into a sword, to make a Star Trek reference, forge it into something new. Like, as I said, it's been for a long time empire-centric. Well, now the empire, this is time of 3 emperors, unless I'm terribly mistaken.
Yes, that's correct.
So Marienburg might have different kind of magical traditions to the Middenlanders, for example. You might have 3 different strange interpretations of magic. What kind of wizards are allowed here? Who comes around? Who's not? You might have weird things like I wouldn't even dare say, but maybe canonized necromancers who are permitted to perform certain things for certain nobles within your Marienburg who can pay the price, or things like that. Really something characterful and that fits well and doesn't wildly thrash against the character of the old world or the old style of Warhammer.
I mean, another option for Empire would, for example, be, I mean, Empire and Sixth Ed kind of became really an army of men. Prior to that, of course, you had halflings, Imperial dwarves as well, of course, who lived in the Empire and sometimes fought for humans, and ogres. And there was more of a sort of a kind of a diversity to Empire there that they might be able to go back to. And I mean, this is also to say nothing about all sorts of, you talked about gnomes, Bard, but I mean, Jabberwockies, Zotes, Fimir, all sorts of things.
The Amphis Baner is in here. I don't think it was ever on the tabletop, the two-headed snake.
Yes.
Which is in the medieval bestiaries. You're probably familiar with those.
Yes. Oh, there are all sorts of ways in which they could kind of go backwards and resurrect quite a lot of interesting things, which do actually have, some kind of sort of canonical legitimacy in the sense that they were appear. Absolutely.
Yeah, it'd be good.
So I think that's where we're kind of going with this moan. We'd quite like them to respect the past, read it all, but then be quite imaginative as well. Think about history as an inspiration, not as a master that you are a mere thrall to.
It's pretty thrall-like in the art so far. We'll get to that, though.
Yes, we'll get to the art. Bard, did you want to talk about your moan with timelines? Because I think, and canonized timelines, because I think that is a very substantial one.
This is a bane to games in general. Especially, I think it's an American thing, actually, because Warhammer never suffered from this until recently, and especially 40K suffers from this. When it started to become big in America, I'm about to blame Americans. I'm not really blaming Americans, but it just happens to be that these things happen. When it started to become bigger in America, you'd read forum posts and they'd say, when are they going to move the timeline forward? When are they going to move the timeline forward? What happens next? And it's very frustrating because the lore of Warhammer, 40K and fantasy, both of these, has always been a matter of background, which is there to support the player's imagination in coming up with their own stories and making their own characters and armies and forging their own narratives that they then share down at the hobby shop or whatever. And binding it to the spine of a preset narrative that gets doled out to you has been the absolute burden. It shackles so many games. White Wolf's vampire games really suffered from that. That's one of the reasons they rebooted it into Requiem. I'm not very experienced with Requiem, but they rebooted it into Requiem. Shadowrun used to suffer from this. It's like Forgotten Realms, the D&D settings are very bad for it. Every supplement that would come out would tell another bit of the story. And if it conflicted with your campaigns, well, they'd say, well, your campaign takes precedence for you, but this is the real story, okay? Now, step back. Games Workshop's always had that because they've had prominent and strong novel lines, but very few of those have been epic fantasy. They usually stick to personal stakes and small adventures, illustrating some of the corners of the world. And that's But with the experience when they canonized the story, let me tell, the first time I ever got mad about this was in 2001 or something, when I was reading the new Ravenloft books they brought out for the 3rd edition. And it was telling, you'd go to the history of like Darkon or a place somewhere, and then they talk about one of the prominent old campaign modules that people played through. This crisis happened, and it'd say, these are the main players, and this happened. And then adventurers solved the problem. Like they'd skip over the actual part where the players come in was an inconvenience to them and the story they wanted to tell, when they shouldn't have been telling this story at all. They should have just been presenting this beautiful bit of background that you then project your adventures and games onto, instead of using it as a huge narrative vehicle. That it hurts games. It has done massive damage to the imaginative validity of Warhammer 40K, as we've seen recently. And it splits people. Previously, before the age of these Primaris Marines, I think they're called, you could go down the hobby shop free. And I've known people who've done this. They said, right, we're going to have a 40K campaign. It's set in this region at this time. So these people are there and these people are there. And you don't have as much freedom to do that kind of thing nowadays, because you've got a lot of Marine players who are around who suddenly can't participate because they only have Primaris, and they didn't exist at the time of that campaign, you know, and so you've locked. It's almost having an effect. That's just one of the effects. That's not even the major one, really, of factionalizing people off, where we can't have an ancient campaign set on those worlds during this particular movement of the craft worlds, for example, were there at this time, according to the law. We'll set it then. Great time. So because you automatically exclude people who don't have, but if you had any Marine army back then, you could have participated, you know. So it's kind of weird like that. That's one of the side effects that it sometimes has. But the real effect is a much more personal one, where it decanonizes your own adventures, which happens when you tried Shadowrun back in the day, or when I tried Shadowrun back in the day and Forgotten Realms. The next novel had come out, and if it contradicted your thing, well, you weren't playing the real game anymore. At least that was the thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a sense you can have a timeline, and that's part of something which can help build, you know, the richness of a world. And so there being certain kind of, you know, events of kind of key into reference, that's obviously essential. But at the same time, if it becomes a kind of a dominating focus, and it becomes something that's kind of, I suppose, revealed as a story that is told and contradicts what you maybe are doing, that can be problematic. I think in Warhammer, the way in which this got much worse was through the explosion of special characters. And I mean, special characters, actual named heroes like Grom the Pouch of Misty Mountain, or, you know, or Tactless or whatever, not just kind of key figures in kind of lore, but actually as kind of sort of heroes on the table, because they became more and more part of the game. And they were sort of initially something that you sort of had to agree with your opponent to use. But then by 8th edition, there are dozens of special characters, you know, in all of the army books, and they tended to get some of the biggest budget kind of models. And then obviously Games Workshop's kind of fluff engine perhaps moved away from, you know, telling stories about individual heroes in particular parts of the world, away from the, you know, the kind of like sort of Genevieve kind of novels, for example, and then, or Gotrex and Felix, and towards something more like the End Times, where you had obviously, you know, all of the kind of the who's, you know, all of the big named persons all kind of doing their stuff. And, you know, pity anyone who was, you know, just I don't know, Chantal the Prophetess or something like that, to speak of my own Bretonnian prophetess, or indeed even my Demon Prince. You know, he probably was a nobody in that kind of a universe. And so, you know, in a narrative sense, what I was doing on my table, I don't know, lacked that kind of sort of legitimacy, I suppose.
Yeah, I can see that. It's important to me to have, like, when I think about my armies, right, whenever I was conceptualizing an army that I'd want to play, I'd always think where they are and what they were doing, what corner of the world they existed in, and the background was so rich that you could project them on it. But when it becomes about specific characters, man, like when in practice, when you see the same characters again, even your own narratives start to become about these other characters, these special characters. This is why I don't like the Middle Earth games that they produce, because there's no provision for your own fellows. Even though I think I'd like the game very much, the rules read very well. I've never played it. I think symbolically a lot of the rules thematically and what they represent work extremely well. But it's you can't have your own dwarf lord and his men. You have to have a specific character, and it's about reliving the specific battles and that sort of thing. There's not really a place for my imagination to live in Middle Earth, really. It's they could have done that. They could have. There's a perfect time in Middle Earth history for games like this that I always say, if you're going to have, if you have the chance to make a game set in Middle Earth, the time you want is the gap of several years, like 11 years or whatever it is, between when Bilbo leaves and when Frodo leaves. I think there's a long gap of time there when things are happening in the world, prime for adventure and prime for your own stories, not necessarily related to the grand movements of these great celestial beings, so to speak.
Yeah.
Although the theme of Lord of the Rings is, of course, that the very small is a factor in the grand thing, but it's not about the grand thing.
But it also creates a kind of, in a sense, an atmosphere of uncertainty, because, you know, what happens in these particular sort of skirmishes, you know, in Middle Earth doesn't have a bearing upon, you know, the grander things at play. And so there is a story that's to be told there that could be one entirely of your telling. When it starts involving, you know, the really major kind of celebrities, then their stories are already quite well described. I mean, what do you think about the effect, I suppose, of so obviously we're having this game in the War of the Three Emperors, and we know what happens in the end times. We know that the world explodes. We know that Age of Sigmar happens, etc., etc. So we know kind of the end of that story in a sense. To me, that almost makes those kind of more incidental kind of struggles between non-named personages in the past maybe more interesting, rather than ones that are featuring special characters, because I know what happens to them in the end times and I know how their story ends, and I'm not interested in a personal narrative, of Luan Leoncoeur, for example, when I know what happens to him in the end times. Although I still might be interested in, a historical Bretonnian duke who, I created myself.
Maybe. And maybe a good scenario that might happen is this duke they've made with the black and white heraldry, or black and red heraldry, sorry. Maybe he is a low-level duke meant to serve as an example of the kind of imaginative character that you could make, who isn't going to feature in grand adventures. However, you did raise something. We know what happens in the end times, and I'm not sure we do anymore, because in the past, Games Workshop has done little retcons here and there, and I would encourage them to do quite a big one, and maybe even pretend this is a reset where the end times didn't happen, because the end times was a complete disaster. Look, the end times made me so mad, because you're going to make a new game, fair enough. The world ends, fair enough, okay, but did you have to ruin it? They went out of their way to demystify the world and rob it of all of its magic before destroying it, which they shouldn't have done. Should have just destroyed it in some cataclysmic maneuver. Big deal. But fair enough. We can deal with that, maybe. But to reveal who the Lady of the Lake is, and Malekith was actually the favorite of Asuryan all along, guys. We planned it. It was in a vault from the 80s, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then there was the Eternity King and all that jazz.
All that jazz, but they ruined all of the mysteries and the magic. See, part of the great experience of playing as a Bretonnian, right, is that there's great mystery over their whole spiritual identity and the identity of their culture, and that sort of thing is what makes them so appealing to me. Even though I never played a Bretonnian army, I've got the book. You bet I've got the book. We've got a couple of books.
Yes.
But that's part of what made them so appealing, to reveal that it was all elven shenanigans all along. I forget which elven goddess it actually turned out to be, but it was that's not exciting. That's boring. That's
and they revealed the Green Knight to be the founder of Bretonnia, Gilles de Breton, as well, rather than, again, that seems less, mainly because I'm not sure it would have been, if he had to have an actual identity, it probably couldn't have been anyone else. And so it's a bit like Scooby-Doo. Oh, the mask came off. Do you know who I am? Said the Green Knight. Why did you need to tell me who you were, Green Knight? We already love you. You're already the Green Knight. You don't need to evoke authority in that way. Taking off his helmet, oh dear. That's the last thing that you do if you're the Green Knight.
Loses all of his mystique. He's an excellent example, because he's one of the more mysterious figures in the whole world, right? Because he appears in times. There's a wonderful illustration in here of him aiding a corner. It's on his page, actually.
It's a magnificent illustration. The Green Knight has always been, well, he has a fabulous model, indeed. A magnificent illustration.
This cornered knight here, back against the wall, his dagger is out desperately, and here's this spectral figure of the Green Knight. And I don't know if you can see it on. There's
a beautiful one in the 5th ed book as well. The Green Knight, even though he was borrowing, of course, very strongly from a sort of classical chivalric ideas, and of course Bretonnia, of course, we must remember, was one of the armies that was basically destroyed in Age of Sigmar completely at the beginning, or given like some joke kind of rules and then sent on its way, because it was viewed to be from generic fantasy, which was, of course, a kind of a boo word, which meant that it couldn't be trademarked. But of course, some of those tropes one finds in generic fantasy are amongst the strongest fantasy tropes one could imagine, and send shivers down one's spine.
The reason it does that is not because it's generic fantasy. This has significant cultural resonance. Who doesn't know the Arthurian lore, right? Who wouldn't have that resonate with them even a little bit? to know what a knight in shining armor is, and the at least, if not the actual ideals of chivalry, the romantic idea of the ideals of chivalry, that sort of thing. It's not pop culture; it's real culture. And when you draw from that, it's very strong. And to dismiss it as generic fantasy is a terrible mistake, in my view.
Yeah, and I mean, I fear that's what they did, and I mean, and that's probably in a sense what they're trying to kind of go back to. I suppose the question is that all they'll kind of end up with in a sense? Now they've gone and ported all of the New Hammer stuff to Age of Sigmar. Will in a sense Warhammer therefore return to becoming more of a sort of a deeply culturally ingrained non-pop culture kind of sort of fantasy, as you say, or will it be possible to get some of the distinctive GW stuff kind of back in there? I mean, they did things like, for example, saying that Skaven are not a core army. Skaven are a completely Games Workshop creation from top to bottom. They say they're going to scale back Chaos. That's also a Games Workshop creation from top to bottom. Even Dark Elves are pretty GW. Most of the factions they've got are the ones that draw most on Tolkien or most on myth or most on legend. And that's interesting that they chose those, precisely the ones they kind of retconned most in Age of Sigmar.
That's an interesting point, because I hadn't considered that. They released that the factions they were supporting, that PDF business, whatever that turned out to be. And that is an excellent point. The Wood Elves are in, aren't they?
They're in, yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating what they do with them for a start. Sorry, with the scaling back of Chaos, that is a very un-Games Workshopian move. See, because when I was playing Wolfram, especially second edition, that's this one.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah.
You'd read the supplements. There was one in particular, I think it's called Karak Asgal. Asgal? I can't see it on the shelves over there. The Dragon Crag. Heavily dwarf themed. It's about an old dwarven hold that gets retaken, and you think, dwarf adventures, and you read it, and they practically falling them over themselves to make sure there was a chaos cult in there, and there's this and the chaos. Even when they went over the halflings, this was a Fantasy Flight move, though. I don't know what book it was, but when they detailed parts of the Empire and the halflings were in there, they were like, "Oh, chaos cult, guys!" Well, because it's like chaos is like the distinctive thing that they lean on that's specifically theirs, even more so than Dark Elves, and probably even more so than Skaven, because
definitely,
are a thing all over the place, really. Although Skaven are probably the best version of the sinister Ratmen that I think I've seen. But Chaos is something they seem to feel is distinctly theirs and is their most marketable, identifiable thing. It's like the crest on a troll slayer. It's that you can't mistake it. Games Workshop, Warhammer game, Chaos. So scaling back on that is a really significant move if that's what they're doing. Because one of my grumble points, one of them, says that I detect that it might just be warming up for later releases. If it's successful, the game might see big Chaos update or big Skaven update, or things like that, where it'll suddenly come back to prominence. But it works lore-wise, because in the old day, I won't pick up the book again. In the old days, if Chaos is at a low ebb, I think is the terminology they used, then maybe humans are safer using their stranger little interpretations of magic, and we can get some new ideas in the magic. They have to. Actually, if they come out with Old World and they go, the colleges of magic, the 8 laws, that's a little bit of a red flag that they're disregarding the very point of going so far back in time.
Yeah.
If they wanted to have those, they could have just gone back 100 years.
Yeah, I think the reason Chaos is so much more powerful than, say, Skaven or Dark Elves is because Dark Elves and Skaven are very specific to a particular race, whereas Chaos is something that can affect kind of anybody. But I think that maybe in a world where Chaos is at a lower ebb, there are some interesting opportunities to focus on certain aspects of Chaos, like, for example, the corruptibility of Chaos. So when you've got Archaon, strutting over, collecting his stuff, and everyone knows the world is on the brink of chaos, and lots of witch hunters in the Empire, really rooting out anything that looks kind of remotely chaotic, making sure if you're practicing magic, sir, it's got to be under a license of one of the 8 colleges of magic. But at a time when Chaos isn't really a threat, maybe some humans are dabbling a little bit of this and that, and maybe it's a little bit more tolerated in society, and so it's all a little bit kind of more ambiguous. So chaos has potentially some interesting representations, I think, in a time when it's not all just Archaon collecting all of his stuff and thundering in from the chaos wastes.
But that's one aspect, but it's also, because of its prominence, has kind of become the more boring aspect, is the rampaging lordly chaos, I guess, in a sense anyway. I got pretty sick of it then, because everything that came out was all chaos, big chaos, or watch out. But in this edition of Wolfrup, I'm going to pick it up again because it's a good book. It's got John Sibbick artwork on the cover. 10 out of 10. This is an example, actually, of complexity coming out of nuance and really pure-hearted. Let's put this in because it's so good. It makes the rules more complex. Well, whatever, that's a side effect. Yep. Its rules for magic include things like afflictions if you do demonology, or even if you're just chaotically aligned or evil aligned in this book, there's the afflictions that come in, and these are extra rules on top that would instantly be cut. You never see them these days, I don't think. I haven't seen the most recent version of Wolfrup, embarrassingly enough. Just haven't had occasion to look at it. But like children will cry in your presence, or animals will show fear, and when you get to the higher levels of affliction or disability, I think it's called, actually, they will attack you on sight. Animals will attack you if they can, because they perceive that there's a wrongness about you. So there's a little bit of subtlety to the chaos in that. But this is also, we've got to put this in. This is such a good idea. We'll have these rules for it, which actually is well reflected in the old editions of Warhammer. There's rules in there that you wouldn't see these days, much to my rage. One in particular is actually a 40k rule. When I was watching a second edition game be played, and I'd seen later edition games of 40k, and they blow up a vehicle, you just remove it from the table. In the older editions, you have to roll for which person in the vehicle you hit, whether the vehicle goes out of control, and if it blows up, it turns into terrain. Yeah, that's so good. It adds more rules, obviously. Yeah, but that's really exciting table stuff. Sorry, I'm rambling a little.
Chariots were the same. They used to be ability. You could hit, the beast pulling it and make it slower. If the chariot was immobilized, the crew could come out and fight on foot. There were absolutely those kinds of things, and that's to say nothing of D1000 mutation tables, which there were in Slaves to the Darkness and Lost and the Damned. D1000 table to see what kind of demonic sword your chaos champion obtained, or his mutation, where you get his legs replaced by tank treads, or his head replaced by a heavy las cannon. There we are. Certainly no shortage of imagination there.
That's complexity, right? But that's not complexity for complexity's sake. That's not to make a complex game that'll appeal to the rule heads. That's, whoa, look at this. Let's have this. It comes from a very pure place, I think. It comes from the idea. And when the idea comes first, then you get rules that matter. You get rules that they call associative rules or associated rules. This was actually something I read in a Rick Priestley article back in the day. It's where I learned about this sort of thing, where the rules reflect the idea that they're supposed to represent. And when they don't, I have a lot less fun with games. Like some editions of D&D have weird rules that don't reflect anything. Like a fighter can, in 4th edition, he marks an enemy, and that enemy is under certain rules after that, not to go into it. But what does it mean to mark an enemy? I don't know. What is the fighter actually doing? It's just a game rule. But in things like the Slayers, for example, the Dwarf Slayer cult, it's pretty clear that the idea came first, and then they wrote the rules to reflect the idea. Conversely, I think more recently in the Wood Elves, I don't know if I have a Wood Elf book here, but in 8th edition, when infantry became more powerful, all of a sudden they needed an executive infantry branch. So they got the Wildwood Rangers. And I thought that really ran quite strongly against the feel of the Wood Elf army, having limited infantry, and the infantry they do have is like skirmishers and things, to suddenly have these Rangers who are described as wanderers, I think, from memory. It's been a while since I read it. And yet they march around shoulder to shoulder in ranks. I thought that's a weird thing to give to the Wood Elves. That's like the rules came before the idea. So Wood Elves, they need an executive or an elite infantry an elite infantry branch. So we'll give them this. They'll have heavy weapons. Maybe they'll have this option and this option. What could they be? A kind of ranger. Let's write the law. So And
so
that's
you end
weaker.
up with a kind of a product that puts that there, or trying to say, well, oh, you know, this army needs to have a certain kind of monstrous sort of infantry, so we're going to go and create demigryph knights or something for the, you know, for the empire. But I think what I like about what you say there, Bard, is that I think sometimes trying to kind of historicize what a game was trying to do, the kind of ideas and the ideas and the concepts they were operating under, makes you understand what they were trying to capture in the rules. And, you know, in the Slaves to the Darkness and Lost in the Dam, this was the late 80s, and at that point, you know, the primordial soup was there, and they were simply trying to, I think, express more than they were to create something that was, you know, discreet and certainly playable. Because of course, in Warhammer 3rd edition, you were supposed to have a games master as a third player in your game. One of the underrated and very significant changes of the, you know, the simplification that came with 4th edition was the end of the games master. And then if you have a games master involved in a war game, then, well, you're playing something, so a different hybrid variety.
There's games that still do the game master thing. I think certain historical games will do that. I don't want to swear to it, but I think Hail Caesar is one such that has provision for a game master running a game and setting the scenario and things like that. I don't know. I don't think it's compulsory in Hail. I haven't seen the most recent Hail Caesar material, but that's a game I found really intriguing. I'm not usually into historicals, but the way they approach that game was fascinating. That's not really the topic of conversation. 40K was a games master game as well back in the Rogue Trader days. So yeah, that adds a completely different dimension, which you would never see like out of Games Workshop today. I don't think. The last time they did it was Inquisitor.
Yeah, true.
I think that was the last time.
Yes, Inquisitor was very much like that, wasn't it? They had an idea of what they wanted. And one senses that idea was also to be found in what John Blanche was doing and the nature of the models they created, which are of a bit of a forerunner in a sense to the really kind of oversized models of tomorrow, where they would work on a completely different scale, and you would have a band of just four individuals. And really, it was much more role play in its nature, and you had the games master and stuff. Very interesting.
That was the last time I think Games Workshop published something that super encouraged role playing. I think it was Inquisitor. Warhammer Quest did that as well. It had a whole role play book. It was a whole other thing. But Inquisitor, they spoke about it's really about crafting some great narrative. It was like an attempt at a narrativist kind of game that rules are secondary, you know, in a sense to they are subservient to the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, and almost certainly, I imagine they would have aimed Inquisitor at an older age group, even at a time when the focus on younger players was already very firmly established. That they still had that capacity to generate, to, you know, make what might be a more specialist game. Maybe that's the niche that Warhammer the Old World is going to go into a bit more of a specialist game.
It'd be a surprise to have a full size army specialist game, although I guess War Master existed.
Yes, it did. God rest its soul.
And it's got beautiful rules as well. I never played it, but I read the rules. I was very fascinated by the orders being able to be misinterpreted and things like that. Oh, that sounded like it would be so much fun. I never played it though. Sadly.
Yeah. It was a magnificent, magnificent game where grand maneuver was really, really very, very kind of important for sure. Did you have any other specific moans, Bard, about various things? Oh, yes, there were some things about particular races, weren't there? I think you had a word to say about what you thought they might do with the dwarfs.
I might need to take a swig of my label-infested drink here to get ready. No, the dwarf. Listen. I didn't like the latter day direction the dwarfs were going in, okay? Because I didn't like any of this newfangled technology, being sort of a dwarf at heart. I didn't like the visual style, and I'm sort of worried that even though they're going back into the past, they're going to be canonized as having a little bit more of these steps toward what looked to me to be a little bit steampunk, and I don't like this.
Yeah,
but there's a good chance they won't, because they already spent their steampunk penny on their Gahadron overlords or whatever they are in Age of Sigmar. So maybe they won't. Maybe with their new material, they'll actually step back into the more traditional looks of the dwarven stuff, and I like that very much. I didn't like those fire gun
Iron Drakes.
I didn't like the Iron Drakes. Oh,
no.
Step back. I liked I didn't like the new Ironbreaker armor. Dwarf models have got steadily worse since the Elder Times.
Yeah.
They used to be so good, and they've gotten a little worse every edition since. They had a real tough time in early plastic when they started making the plastic. Oh.
When you got into the sort of monopose kind of era. I think Orcs had a similar problem with that as well. I mean, that's, of course, just something that's great about, the early 90s and late 80s model ranges, as there were hundreds of individuals. And the Dwarves... Yeah. I think got pushed a bit too close, a bit too much towards professional soldiers, and thus became, they lost some of that kind of camaraderie that
Not
you
so
might.
Much the clansmen.
Yeah. Indeed, indeed. Yeah, they might. I mean, they say Iron Drakes were perhaps slightly exceptional in their nature, I think, in the Dwarf book. And so perhaps they're the only unit for whom that was true. But we'll see whether they'll actually resist the kind of whole steampunk thing. That would
they
be...
also had bombers and things like that.
Yeah. They had the gyrocopter and then the gyro bomber as well, which was a more upgraded kind of sort of edition.
Nothing wrong with them conceptually, of course. I just didn't like the models, okay? I didn't like the way they looked. They looked a little too modern to be dwarven. I think dwarven things should echo an age that is not only old but lost, because the dwarves are very much an on the defensive, fading people, even more so than the elves. All right, elves are about stasis and preserved grandeur.
Yes.
Okay? That isn't going to change, or so they believe. The dwarfs are fading, and they know it, and they should be in their older thing. It should echo an earlier time. Yeah. And I think there's a chance to do that very directly. But if you make new models that echo the older models, even if it's just a little bit, I'd be happy to see it, even if it's just a little bit. But all the way would be better if they echo those older models, the style of the dwarfs. Because, man, those Iron Drakes, I didn't like. They seem, the reason I didn't like them is because they seem to be the rules came before the idea kind of thing. I don't know if that's true. I'm not really experienced enough in the edition of those days to know if that's true, but it seemed like, they need some shooty thing that can do this function. Let's make it up. Let's make it up.
Yeah, they need something that's kind of better than handguns to give dwarves a kind of an elite shooty kind of choice. I'm sure that's true. And that was partly a product of, kind of games playing experience, because the crossbows and handguns, which had basically the same legacy rules forever, weren't kind of cutting it in the same way. So, on the table, competitively, Iron Drakes are where it is at as a dwarf shooting army. They're really good. There's also a special character called Grumbles, who's a very, I do not think would be to your approval, Bard. He's, you can put him in there and he makes them even better. And yes, and the thing is, when something gets good in competitive meta, you meet quite a lot of Grumbles. He's sometimes on several tables at once. Sometimes, if two dwarf armies clash, Grumbles might find himself fighting Grumbles.
Well, if I was to use like characters like that, I'd take a page out of your book, and at least for my own army, rename him. You've got Ariadne the Spider.
Yes,
if I remember correctly, that it's actually a representative of another beast.
It's Skylar the Spawn. That's what the real thing is.
Yeah, that's it. But I'd like to actually note on the end of that dwarf point that I don't actually oppose new things just out of hand. In particular, I didn't like those Wildwood Rangers because I thought they went against the idea of the Wood Elves. And I didn't like this newfangled dwarf stuff because I think it goes against the core idea and the core appeal of the dwarfs. I used to use an analogy for Warhammer, that it was like a garden, okay? And it's full of these beautiful and wondrous things. And you're sitting in a house, and you're in a long hallway that looks out into the garden through several windows. And through this window, you can see these things. And a few editions later, because that's what the windows represent, there's Vargulfs all of a sudden in Sylvania. They were always there. But Warhammer is kind of a setting, because it was presented traditionally as background and not narrative, it would regenerate itself and would change a little every time it would come. And I'm not against that out of hand. I'm not against it changing a little. And these things like Demigryph Knights, which I actually don't know their lore, but let's say Demigryph Knights presented as always having been a grand part of the Empire. I don't know if that's true because I didn't read their book. But I'm not really opposed to that. It's only when they clash with the core idea that I feel is important to the army at hand or to the game in general, when they're really a clashing thing. Like putting witch hunters in the army as a unit, that doesn't, as a hero, that really doesn't work for me. All these years They haven't put witch hunters in, and then all of a sudden in 8th edition, let's have a witch hunter hero. I guess because they're at the bottom of the barrel by then, I'm not sure. But a witch hunter is a very personally driven character. He's not going to be in any old army. He's got specific goals and ideas and is better suited to Mordheim.
Yeah, there was well, indeed, absolutely, and they're really cool in Mordheim. I think in Empire, what happened was that there was a swing towards the becoming more, much more religious and much more devout. And so they had the kind of like an arch-lector being one of their kind of heroes and warrior priests. And I think that witch hunters fitted into that a little bit more. I suppose flagellants also perhaps to some extent. And so I think that's the pivot that they were trying to go through. But I suppose, my idea of what the Empire was always from like the Dark Omen video game and Morgan Bernhardt and all of that, who had his really just it was a very kind of cynical, kind of paymaster type individual, and really was just basically his overwhelming ideology was pragmatism. And there was something I quite liked about that, because he's not a Bretonian. No, absolutely not. He's a mercenary commander, but he's also a pragmatist and just, respects other men that are.
I liked Luther Flamestrike a lot.
Yes.
That which is dead can still burn in Dark Omen. Strong game, Dark Omen.
Oh, yes. Very funny game, too.
Yes. Captured the spirit and feel of Warhammer without slavishly copying the rules. And this is something I always recommend that games do if they're going to base something on like D&D or something. The rules aren't the game. There's something in the game that is the spirit. And if you can capture it in a way that's more suitable for a computer game than just reproducing the tabletop rules, you're much better off. You'll be a much better representation of the game. And Dark Omen with Warhammer, great example.
Really did nicely.
Much better than Total War. I have no time for Total War. I don't
absolutely.
Like
I think the Dark Omen also, the thing was with it was it's also funny as well. The voice acting is very humorous. They used the full gamut, I think, of like English regional accents as well, and so that whole aspect of things were in there that was just sort of previously lost. There's a mare that talks with a very strong Midlands kind of accent. A dwarf has a Yorkshire accent. Okay, fair enough. There's that diversity there that's just kind of cool, and it's just very, very humorous and funny. It's got I think the humor in it is quite British as well, actually, and I like that aspect of it, because there is, Warhammer fantasy was always a bit humorous and a bit tongue-in-cheek, and I feel that really kind of got lost over time. And so a bit of that back in there, to be honest, that would also be something I'd like to see. I'm pretty pessimistic I'm going to get that, though, because
it still has elements of satire and things like that, but it doesn't have outright humor as often. And it in the olden days, at least, listen to me, you little old grumble, but that's what this is all about.
Yeah, that's fine. This is what it's all about. I remember the olden days. I would like to go back there.
The humor was wielded so skillfully and so well that it didn't disrupt the other themes at hand, as sometimes it didn't undercut or undermine, at least not so far as I ever saw. So it was important in that regard as well.
Yeah, there was that. That was really cool. Right, Bard, shall we look at some pictures now?
Yes.
I think we might be. Right, okay, I'm going to open that. We'll actually do an intermission here on the recording, partly because, as you can see, the sun, look at this.
I can see it, yeah.
Face. I'm going to do something about that, and then we'll come and look at the pictures. Anyway, so
all right. I need to refresh my drink.
All right, we're going to pick up again, and just so I can try to take Bard on his own game, look, this is an even older Bretonian army book with things in there that we were just discussing. Like this brilliant page where you could design your own Bretonian horse livery. We've got some rather suspicious ones here, like orange dots. Not really sure that would perhaps translate to any particularly prestigious known house, but there it is. Excellent. Both Bretonian army books, excellent. Yeah. Right, let's fire up this PowerPoint presentation and have a little look at these pictures, Bard, in which there is something to say. Does that all register where you are?
I see it. Does it register in your lands? That's the true question.
It does register in my lands and yours. So here we are. So, I mean, there have been quite a few pictures that have been released for Warhammer the Old World. If you haven't seen them, it's not difficult to find. Many of them are these color illustrations of individual troop types, but there are also some black and white ones as well, which much more recall, I think, the feel of some of the sort of internal army book illustrations from a time when full color was not available, and when drawing in black and white, a skill of which I am very, very respectful of for all sorts of reasons, was in vogue. And we wanted to have a look at some of these, and also with reference to illustrating some of our Grumbles. So here, we've got these Bretonnians. Now, one thing I remember you mentioning, Bard, you didn't like the way they'd all become rather uniform and had all adopted this red and black kind of heraldry, unlike the infinite diversity of the Knights of old.
It spoils part of the classic look of the Bretonnians. Now, I suspect the reason they've done this, I think they might even admit as much. I don't know if they admit it directly. It's to give permission, so to speak, to players who don't want to have the grand pageant of different colored knights, as it probably should be, who want to have, because if they say in the book that sometimes knights will adopt the heraldry of like the uppermost knight in the army or their retinue, then players can breathe a sigh of relief and feel like they're still within the real business of Warhammer, of Bretonnia, even if they don't want to go to the extra creative step of having all this fabulous livery, which is really the real way to go, in my opinion. But a lot of people, Bretonnian players I know, have struggled with this a little bit, you know, because it's a lot of extra work, it's a lot of extra paints and that sort of thing. So many people will have had quite uniform Bretonnian armies in the past. But having special permission is like a hallmark of the modern game, by the way, for players that maybe aren't that imaginative or aren't willing to go into the depths of imagination so much. Having the game itself authorize you to do something is I guess comforting. And to its weird extreme, it is seen in like certain role-playing games where you have to have a special rule and a special ability to do something like kick sand in someone's face. And even then you can only do it once per day or something like that. That's extreme, requires of permission that is rather more restrictive. So I've gone on a secret rant there.
It seems, though, very strange, I suppose, to a gamer of my generation that a gamer should require, I suppose, special dispensation for the company to do something or feel as though they're sanctioned in doing so. Because, of course, you know, paint your Bretonnians however you like, and that should just be, I suppose, including a color scheme with orange dots all over them, if that may please you. But they seem
some people still value being authentic,
yes,
even though they, you know, and this lets you be authentic with a straightforward uniform color scheme, I guess, if they shifted in that direction.
Yes, I suppose it's fair enough, although, as I say, a little dull. I also think it might be a sort of because it makes painting, as you say, a little bit easier. You're not having to think of all of these different kind of color schemes and master only a few kind of bits of paint schemes. I also note that they've decided to make most of the horse kind of black as well, because that kind of horse, that kind of barding, that cloth kind of barding, quite difficult to paint properly. You need to know when to stop when you're painting that, or else it goes too far. So they've decided to just make it black. And I think that means that players will just spray it back and leave it black, which might also be quite convenient.
I suspect also that they're going to go in for the transfer sheets, maybe. So you don't, if you're going to have, if you're not going for the grand pageant army where you have to come up with heraldry for every knight, if you wanted to, of course, if you wanted to go fully Bretonnian authenticity, you probably get a large transfer sheet of like the axes there or some other heraldry and not feel as though you're bogged down in your army and really develop, which I think is actually an army building hazard, is developing a level of contempt for the army you're trying to build, because it takes so long to get through all of this, and it can be a real trial for some. But the reason I don't like it so much is because I think it goes against really one of the central points of identity about the Bretonnian army and how they look, which is non-uniform. All these individual knights looking for their own glory, which is one of the central themes of Bretonnian.
Yes, and indeed of knightly chivalry, you know, full stop. that they're not sort of being, subservient to something more kind of uniform. I think that that transfer point you made is very true. The 6th edition Bretonnian knights, which are the ones that are sort of being brought back, have little kind of raised shields on their barding, which enable one to place a transfer on. In 4th and 5th edition, there were no such shields. You simply had to freehand your heraldry on, which I kind of rather liked. Yes.
That's how it was in the ancient age. You
exactly.
develop those skills, and you could tell your oldest models by which ones looked the most dodgy.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. And anyway, so then we have, and this point is going to be made several times, and this was really the Bard's point, but I suppose I get the chance to kind of make it first, is that, well, now you were making a point about blandness. And as you can see, there's that knight there on his charger. It's all right, isn't it? It's fine, quite circle. And then we've got some other 2 knights, in fact, both of the knights from the 5th and 6th edition army books. They look rather more dynamic to me. I especially like the 6th edition one there on the left.
These are also covers, so these should be expected to be spectacular.
Yes, we must be reasonable in that expectation.
But this illustrates the shifting of the styles as well, from the oldest on the right there, that we can see so far, to the more recent, where they go in for a little bit more realism, a little less grandeur, maybe even a little less model-like, with the enormous headpiece with the detailed face and the coloured-in teeth on the knight on the right there. The 5th edition knight, I should say. Beautiful banner, though, the pennant with the grail. Oh, could stand to see a little bit more of that on the left, frankly. But it's more about a shifting of art styles to with the 6th edition one is where the freeze happened. I call it the freeze, the sort of a style freeze. Where I think Mordheim is what caused it. Mordheim came along and it had what people call gritty realism. There must be a better name for it than that. And that's where the style stopped, and it stayed there in various degrees of quality, and it didn't move again. It left this extravagant, colorful style behind, even though it's still extravagant and colorful. Hey, don't get me wrong, but not quite so much as the older days. This is just one edition prior too. How long did an edition last at that time?
Usually about 4 or 5 years. But this Mordheim point was when 6th edition kind of came in, and Bretonnia were one of the later armies to be released in 6th ed. And that gritty realism, as you call it, was absolutely in vogue for Warhammer then. It also coincided with the time when players were encouraged to spray paint their armies black to begin with, rather than skull white, which I think is a related phenomenon.
Big difference. You can split Warhammer into 2 eras if you really want to. Goblin green and not Goblin green.
Yeah.
And 5th edition is Goblin green still. That's when, no matter what, when Warhammer Quest came out, okay, this is how strong the Goblin green style was. In White Dwarf, they always had the articles featuring Warhammer Quest, and that's a dungeon delving game. And yet all the heroes and enemies still had Goblin green and flock grass on their bases, because that's just how it was done.
And in 40k as well.
Yes, of course.
And Necromunda as well.
Yeah, because, well, that style suited the color trends of those days, the McVeigh era, the Mike McVeigh, legendary, sort of very influential Warhammer painter, very bright and radical colors. I guess they weren't radical in the sense that they were revolutionizing it, because that was the trend, but he did some very good work with especially reds. Red used to be the color of Warhammer in general. Absolutely. Everything was red.
Yeah.
But man, Goblin green era was phased out with Mordheim, because Mordheim was set in this ruined and cursed city, for those who aren't aware. So they went with the more somber, I don't know what color it was Graveyard Earth maybe, or one of the browns, or a blend probably. And that sort of became the canon muted, neutral
Agrax Earthshade later on, I think.
Yeah, that's a wash.
Indeed. That's a wash, okay, or later on. But yes, muddy brown.
Yeah. But they went for the neutral tone, and fair enough. And admittedly, it does work better for various environments with the brown sort of tone and the sand, rather than heavily individualized terrain on the base. That worked better.
They also pivoted at that time to a slightly less its proponents would say a less kind of goofy kind of sculpting, because this was also a time when multi-part plastics started appearing, and it was away from kind of monopose. And so there was, I think, a bit of a swing back to that more realistic, gritty style. I also think because the 6th edition was supposed to be a rebellion against the hero-centric edition of old, so there was a little bit more focus maybe upon, the everyman kind of trooper. And so perhaps some of the the styles were designed to kind of slightly make him the kind of center of attention rather than the hero. And that's something that some of the 6th edition people quite like a little bit about that. It's maybe the least hero kind of centric of them.
I've seen some disparagement of old Hero Hammer here and there, but I see the appeal.
I do too. I would defend it till my last. I didn't like 6th edition when it came out. I liked the cheesy red period and all the overpowered heroes and all that kind of nonsense. That was when I was, I don't know, 10 or something, but that was what did it for me.
If nothing else, it's vibrant, man.
Yes.
But the battle reports in the old White Dwarfs, the character of those were very different from what would later come, because the kind of games they were playing and the way they played seemed to be bent towards getting the two champions to meet, or the two most interesting characters, or they wanted the most interesting conflict to happen. Like your champion knight must fight the monster. Oh, that's got to happen. And I suspect that a lot of them were worked, to use a wrestling term, like maybe not legitimately played out quite as they would have tactically. We've got to have we want the booking to be the two champions.
Absolutely. But in the tournament, the Grand Theogenist would hide behind a hill, way away from Archaon, but not in the White Dwarf battle report, where he heedlessly charges into him.
Of course.
With a fit of kind of fury. All right, we've got some Tomb Kings here as well. What do you think about these, Bard?
I think look, this can go for all of the new release things. What's fascinating about these is that they're presented as though they're concept art. Now, this is, I believe, new art. Okay,
it is new.
I haven't, except with a little asterisk, I haven't seen it before, but it's presented like it's concept art that they've been working on. But what's funny about it is that it seems performative to me, because these aren't concepts. These are new. The concept's been done and the models have existed for decades.
Yes.
So we're not revealing the work process here. We're showing you something familiar so that you'll know that it's still there.
Yeah, and this is most, I think, striking with this one, the Necrosphinx. If you look at the actual model of the Necrosphinx, which is a quite statue-like kind of model, this could just simply be an artist drawing the model of the Necrosphinx. That makes your point exactly.
I sort of have kind of a cynical view of that, in the sense that they want you to paint like a realistic version of their model soldiers, so they can then pretend that they were inspired by this art and they created the model from that. I don't know if that's true. That's speculation. But I have heard quite often many companies, Games Workshop included, will direct its artists just to paint the model. And I think that's exactly what we've got here. I really hate the Necrosphinx.
Is that because, do you think that it's more desirable to be seen to be inspired by a piece of art to create a model than it is the reverse? But I'm not really sure why that should be true, but it seems to be that is the presumption.
I don't know that that's true, but I've got a suspicion that, because what would the motivation be otherwise? Why wouldn't you want a model of yours drawn in such a way that it's reinvented well, maybe not reinvented, but it looks spectacular,
animated, exactly,
isn't just the model again in a picture. And I'm not saying that's blanket the directive, but that it's something that comes up for artists, that they have to sublimate their creativity now and then because of what the client wants, or what their employer wants, or what the brief is, and things like that. And that looks to be the case here, because this isn't new. This isn't concept art, like I said. This is just a reminder that they have it in mind. It's almost a complete waste for it to even exist.
Yeah, and I think I remember when that was being revealed at Warhammer Fest, where you can see the sort of kind of live footage of it there, that when it was revealed, there was a kind of a cheer, not out of, I think, appreciation of the artwork, but of appreciation of, we remember the Necrosphinx. There it is. In a little bit like, I don't know, like a kind of a callback in the sort of, the remade Star Wars. Yeah, look, there it is again. We remember that.
Maybe
And
maybe they appreciate the big monster phase of Warhammer. I think we're still going back to that, by the way. The Games Workshop are all about the big centerpiece, expensive models, to the point where they've made whole armies of them.
In the old days, there was only a 40mm base. That was as big as it got.
That's one thing I liked about Bretonnia, is they didn't have, the closest thing they had to the centerpiece giant model was the trebuchet.
Yeah, or the Hippogriff, Lord Hippogriff, I guess.
Yeah, but that's not mega huge
No.
or anything. That's certainly a centerpiece, but it's not like a giant model, a giant monster, or
yes,
or something that overshadows all these other things.
Yes, and so we've got this, obviously, this sort of Tomb King chariot here, where it's and these are going to be I think these might be Tomb Guard, actually, the kind of sort of elite Tomb King kind of unit that sort of march with the Tomb King, and we've also got this illustration here, which
Yes,
BARD has discovered, which is there to illustrate, wow, that these things are not new or very dynamic compared to back in your day.
It's fascinating to me that they feel the need to redraw this in like limited concept art form when they have a really excellent, that's a Paul Dainton, I think. Artwork called Skeleton Chariots. It's the name of the painting. It's really strange because they already have this, and it's like, well, we need to do a new one. We don't want to reuse the old artwork, or they'll know. But anyone who's familiar with the old artwork will see the new one and think that's Paul Dainton's Skeleton Chariots. It's almost the very same image. Although it does, I don't really want to disparage the artist of the modern ones, because I think it is quite well done, and there is elements of it that are really strong. In particular, the way the foremost skeletal horse is coming directly at you. Skeletons can be a real challenge, to make them seem threatening, because intellectually, or something like subliminally, maybe you realize that they have no muscle, they have no weight, so you have to give them something to make them threatening. And there's a real wonderful sense of imminent danger here, because it's got this great sense of motion. The perspective is really strong, the head is so huge, and because the other one is so far away and angled in the other direction, the danger seems very broad, and between them is the great blade, as it was in the original.
I mean, it's in motion. It's in motion, this one. One thing I quite like about it is it's clearly traveling in a particular direction, even though the creatures themselves are blind. And yet there seems to be a very strong sense of purpose about where they're charging to. And this particular one in the foreground seems to be looking at it, even though it can't, because it's got no eyes.
Yeah. I actually think this new version seems a little bit more threatening than the other, more directly threatening.
Yes.
But the major difference, and I wonder if this is the reason, is that this one has spears that it throws, and the other one has a bow. Maybe that spears aren't going to be an option in the new rules, so they had to redraw the image to bring it into.
Possibly. I think this one's got a. Oh no, you're right. They're javelins.
It's javelins, yeah, that's the correct.
Yes. And then we've got. Well, this is the only orc we've seen. There he is, riding a boar. It's fair enough, And then, well, bang! Look what we've got. Look what we've got here.
Boy, this is very vibrant and characterful old artwork. I think it is probably David Gallagher on the left there. I don't quite. It looks like Gallagher. Or I guess it could be Jeff Taylor. The one on the right is an Inferno magazine cover. And it's one of the less seen ones, but it's extravagant and wild and strong. This is an illustration again of the shifting of styles. To one point I'd actually like to make is the weaponry, because on the new model we've got like a really canonized sort of chopper. It's like it's from the style guide itself. It looks just like the usual chopper that you see on the models of the orcs that you buy. It's very uniform with the choppers of this period. But the older ones are a little wilder. They've got these axes, very barbaric. One's got a flail, and the one on the right has this great serrated chopper, because the orcs are a little bit wild and chaotic themselves, so their weapons would be likewise a little bit wild and chaotic. And they're less forged in like Saruman's Uruk-hai sword factory that we see in the Lord of the Rings film. Less uniform, which I think is a stronger visual. Although I think in the models themselves, the uniformity of the blade goes back quite a long way. I don't know the last time they had such shiny steel axes and interesting serrated blades outside of like particular characters.
Well, they had monopose bores in 4th edition, which were plastic. In 3rd ed, you start getting bores that have much more variety, because the bores themselves are also metal, which is kind of really, really cool. One thing I think is worth mentioning is kind of like sort of the kind of the anatomy of the whole thing. The boar, in these modern images, look at the thing. Its head is absolutely enormous. I mean, and it's really getting also in the one on the left here, the boars are kind of almost the star of the show in a certain way. I mean, they really are a very important part of the image, whereas this looks like more of a dull kind of riding beast that spent its life in a pen and is being sallied out by its rider. It doesn't look particularly vicious, does it?
I don't mind this because it does look heavy. Like if you look at the way the ground has been depicted, it's like a splat, like that. Yep. Like the boar is setting its weight down as it lunges. That's pretty good, and that's the sign of some good artwork there. Incidentally, it's not really a question of artistic skill on display in this case, because it matches it doesn't match, but it echoes the motion of the skeleton chariot from earlier. This is the motion of the boar. The weight goes down, and it's a ponderous creature. So if it didn't have that bit of ground and shadow beneath it, it would be a much weaker sort of illustration of a boar.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem though that when the various artists, were drawing it, at the kind of time where it was, Gallagher or Gibbons or whatever it was, they seem to have a particular style that was perhaps maybe a little bit more individual. Whereas I sense that I don't know who did this artwork, and I guess we'll probably never be told because I guess it's GW. That they look as though they're coming from a much more uniform kind of brief that's inspired by the kind of the models, and so they're trying to look as though they are, as you said before, Bard, the drawings of the miniatures, and they're all part of a coherent brand. Whereas this one with that orc with a flail, I can tell you that there's not even the option to equip orcs with flails in that army book. I looked at that as a kid and thought, what? I want to give my boar boy a flail.
Well, why didn't you? Surely this is inspiration for a conversion.
I did. I found a 3rd ed model that had a flail, and I just ignored that because clearly it was ridiculous. Why shouldn't a boar boy have a flail?
Exactly.
Clearly they do here.
Triple-headed flail, no less.
Absolutely.
They look so bloodthirsty, those boars there, actually. They remind me of a Les Edwards painting. I forget the name of it, but it's got a bloodthirsty pig in it that's quite threatening.
They also seem to me, because you remember the lore of the boar boys at that time, the boar made you take a leadership cut if you rode it because it was so unruly. That boar doesn't look as unruly to me. That looks as though the master the rider is in control of the mount to a much greater extent.
Yeah, maybe you may be right.
Maybe so. Like that, clinging on for all life, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, he's clinging on at all, which is kind of a detail that is rare on the boar boys, because they're like gung-ho, like they're a little bit cavalier, for lack of a better term. He's got a firm hold of its mane there. The boars have manes? I guess they do.
Yes.
Razorbacks.
Yes. And then we had some Empire here as well. So these ones I think are quite interesting. The two on the left look quite historical to me. The one on the right is a flagellant.
Flagellants are also historical.
Yes.
Degree.
Indeed.
Maybe not to the flail bearing of that sort degree. They're also uniform. I think we might be looking at another. Well, why wouldn't they be? If you're going to have Empire men, why wouldn't you paint them like in a matching sort of colors? But we might have another situation where there's going to be like a canonized example army that has a special name and maybe a specially characterized leader, perhaps. But I quite like that these might not be Empire men. They might be Marienburgers, because they go in for those giant feathered hats, don't they?
Yeah.
Might be a Marienburger archer or huntsman.
That's more possible, actually, because I think they might go down to the road of expressing that kind of diversity quite a lot more, actually, from everything we've seen from the maps. So, there may well be So I don't think they're going to go like the Breton. They're going to go the opposite way of the Bretonians, if anything, it seems. And local diversity is going to be emphasized.
Yeah, well, I'd like that. Well, they better if they're going to have like three different. What's he?
Three emperors.
Imperial fact, yeah, three emperors.
Yeah, they all look the same. They're troops.
Three strong personalities, maybe that can be read throughout the faction. That'd be really, like I said, there's real potential here, man. There's gold in the hills of the old world.
There is, and can they find it? We've got here to support this. Well, these are some images of. Well, these are kind of free company fighters, I suppose, who are more of a kind of a ragbag. So maybe they're not as comparable. But the chap there on the right is a flagellant, and there's an interesting. I suppose that shows a real extreme kind of deviation there, and kind of art style, and also just the anatomy of them as well. I mean, this guy is, like 5 heads tall or something, and so he's really a very cartoonized a kind of figure, compared to the flagellant we saw before, who was a lot more realistic.
Yeah, he's very stylized, but he's stylized in a manner that's very in keeping with his era of Games Workshop games, which is good. I appreciate him greatly. He's also not as exposed as later. Actually, he might be like among the leaders of the flag. I don't remember the context that we see this picture in or where it is. It's in my art book, but that's
Fourth Ed Empire Army book, and he's also the representative flagellant that you see from Dark Omen as well. Not the regiment leader, who looks very different, but when you look at flagellants in the bestiary, he's there. And I believe they may have even coloured the image especially for this, and that's what you can see here.
That's where I know him from. Because he's very
Eusebio the Bleak. Well, that was the
Eusebio the Bleak. I was going to say Erblad Rotgut, but he's the ogre.
He's the ogre, exactly. Different. Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Meanwhile, these other fellows, this is an excellent bit of artwork, by the way. The historical buckler, the great sword, free company men. I don't remember the rules for these fellows, but look at how hodgepodge this unit is with its various weapons and all of that sort of thing. They're very grizzled. Excellent stuff.
Yeah, it is indeed excellent. So then we move on to, I guess, a few of the sort of black and white kind of images, which I like more, I think, significantly more than the color images, which I find mostly a little bit kind of bland. This one I really quite like, actually, because it looks like, again, the sort of kind of MG artworks that you might have seen in a lot of army books, the Gibbons pieces. And, this has got this Grail Knight. Well, I'm not entirely sure what's happening, because if those are meant to be battle pilgrims, then battle pilgrims don't really traditionally give the Grail Knight his sword. They just kind of hang around by him, and the Grail Knight finds them really irritating. So maybe they're being a bit obsequious, and the Grail Knight's just a bit hacked off. We may infer. But there's something there in that image that it's conveying, which I quite like. It's not bland at all.
Well, this is, to me, the most promising and most disappointing image, actually. Promising because it's not just a battle image and an illustration of a warrior at war. There's something of the culture of Bretonia here that you see.
Yes.
Although I don't like the skull around that fellow's chain back there. That's an imperial move, the skull.
Yeah.
I think Bretonia do other things. But I think it's actually quite a poor image. Like a lot of work of this kind, it seems to have been stopped in an unfinished sort of a state.
Yeah.
And I think the knight's pose is very weak. He's got this closed posture. It makes him seem a little nervous. He's got his hawk upon him. He looks a little bit like an action figure with these thickened legs. He doesn't look like he's in proper armor. There's something wrong. And the way that the lance is obliterated, for some reason, by heaven, leave that lance in. Because you don't know it's a lance right away. It's like a large jousting lance. It took me a while to see what is he even holding there. And I recognized it as a lance, but the long lance tip is gone. Surely it would have been better if that was in. And like the hilt of the sword is a little bit misshapen. Like it's not.
I read this as him having his arms folded and looking a bit hacked off. Perhaps I've just leapt to something the artist didn't intend there, I suspect.
Who knows? I can only tell you what I see. And,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's a little strange. It's, to me, there's a stasis to the knight that I don't really hold with. But what I do appreciate about it is that it's a cultural image. But if when they release an army book for these, we can only hope that they're going to have something like in the 6th edition army book on the page about the knight's vows, where you actually see some peasants. There's like just a little slice of life in the art of the Bretonnians. You see all these wretched people. There's a lordly knight on the other page. We should have put that in there, actually. I didn't think of this. Yeah. And there's like a herald who's reading out some proclamation or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And over the page, there's another really excellent one of I think it's the only depiction in the book of a knight encountering the Lady of the Lake. Yeah. There's another 2 pages.
Oh yeah, that's a very famous image there. But I think in Bretonnia, one thing there's always been a tension is between the nobles and the peasantry. So in the Nigel Stillman Bretonnian book, the peasants, the nobility, are much more a benevolent kind of rulers, and the suffering of the masses is not depicted. But in the grim, darkened world of 6th edition, inspired by Mordheim and such like, it's very antagonistic. And, there's the lords in their castles, and the peasants are just ground down serfs with nothing. So I don't know what this one kind of implies. Clearly, we know who the master and who is and who isn't, but what does the master think of his servants there? Does he view them with contempt, which is sort of what I was reading into the image?
Well, his face is obscured, so we can't tell. There's ambiguity. And he's not looking at them. Okay, he's looking beyond them, and we don't know exactly what this entails. I don't think they're battle pilgrims. They don't strike me as battle pilgrims. They're not. They're not wretched enough.
The skull might be one thing, because they kind of wear the skulls of Grail Knights. Maybe I don't know what they are. Perhaps they're something new.
They look too old to be squires, but they might be squires.
Conceivably.
You imagine, because they're doing looks like squire-like duty here.
Yeah, exactly.
Ritualized performance of some sort.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they are battle pilgrims. And unfortunately, they might be using battle pilgrims to perform squire-like functions, which would be, well, a bit of a misunderstanding. In fact, completely. Because the battle pilgrims are really annoying for the Grail Knight, unlike the squires who are there to help him.
Maybe it's another regeneration of the Bretonnians. It might be careful what you wish for sort of scenario here for us. Because between the Stillman version and the 6th edition version, that's a good example of part of the Warhammer world regenerating itself in quite a significantly different form. So it might happen again in certain quarters of Bretonnia here. Do you want to go back to the same, or do you want to take a chance on something maybe a little new?
Yeah.
Who knows?
I mean, to continue with Bretonnia, we've got kind of 2 images here. This is, again, one of these black and white images that we've seen appear. We've got contrast with another black and white image from the Bretonnian book, which also shows Bretonnians fighting the undead as well, quite kind of relevantly.
It's almost the same. It's like they wanted the second one is a Karl Kopinski painting called Bretonnians versus Undead, I think its title is. What's interesting, the key difference is that the Bretonnian side is not just ascendant on this image. He's clearly winning. He's smashing the skull of a skeleton in, whereas in the other one, it's about to happen. So it's not so definitively taking sides. And I wonder if that's why they went with what is virtually a repaint or a remake of the same image again, and only not quite as good, but still really good. Like this is the champion of the pictures as far as technical work goes from the new lot, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when you depict a kind of a knight on the charge, I think the temptation in art is to depict the knight in the ascendancy, mainly because I suppose when a knight charges, he normally is in the ascendancy. Whereas in this image, as you say, it's not entirely clear, whether he will be or not. I mean, obviously there's sort of pike-armed infantry here that, hasn't sort of kind of hit him, but he's got his little kind of morning star. But it's a little bit kind of unclear, in its nature.
Here he's riding into danger, and the other one he's riding to victory, like riding to glory.
Yes.
With sort of a subtle kind of way. It's a little bit of a difference.
Yes. I mean, I suppose the other thing is just simply that in terms of the kind of, the time spent, I suppose, for the artist to create such images, one suspects that this, a little bit like the arming ritual one that we saw, the presentation of the sword, has a slightly very straggled at the edges kind of look to it, which one might say was, artistic. Whereas this one, well, doesn't really have that in the kind of same way. There's, of course, the implication of a much larger battle taking place, very, very skillfully depicted, of course, outside of the main focus of attention. In this one, well, there are some other knights that we can see in the background. A very misty day, it seems, but I can only see 4 skeletons.
Artistic incompletion is something you see now and then. We were just talking about the knight presenting his sword to the Lady of the Lake. If you look at that one, it's has frayed and sketchy edges as well. But yeah, you can only see this one's more ambiguous as to what the situation is, right? This might be the cleaning up of a long battle, maybe, or the final victorious charge of these knights. He's the banner bearer too, which is why he's got a flail instead of a lance. Ah, so good. It's like it's a really strong image. I'm a great fan of flails, so I'm always happy to see flails.
Absolutely, indeed. We've got a carrion here. This is the only undead thing. This to me is very interesting because carrions are not exactly perhaps particularly prominent kind of creatures. It looks very vulture-like. And yes, wow. Reminds me very much of the kind of thing you could have had in a 4th Ed Army book, when black and white was the only mechanism of printing.
Yeah, maybe so. There's not a lot of carrion artwork, I don't think, and I don't have like a full catalogue of Warhammer books, but I rarely see carrion. The only carrion artwork I can think of that isn't army book is also in my roleplay books. In the
carrion used to, when undead were a fused army, the carrion used to have a ghostly rider, little Grim Reaper guy on top who sort of fed it. Only later did the carrion jettison its rider when it became a Tomb King piece and become just this bird, more sort of kind of vulture-like in that regard. So there was a little bit of complexity, I think, to the old carrion, which is kind of sort of lost there.
Well, in the role-playing games, the carrion, there's actually, it's one of the adventures, I forget which, the carrion has a rider, and I always thought, ride a carrion? Obviously, they're huge, so I'm not surprised you can ride a carrion. But one of the scenarios has you face off against a carrion with its rider. Yeah.
Okay. A couple more images here before we discuss some models. There's a Bretonnian bowman, and we've got an Ushabti. Yeah, he looks a bit kind of vicious, I suppose. There's a similar picture of an archer actually in one of the Bretonnian books. Actually, similar composition of an archer where you're kind of looking at him. That's meant to be a bit gritty, and he's got these kind of rat there around his waist.
Look, we're back in bland territory again with these seem to be just reminders, public and large reminders that we're thinking about these things. We haven't changed these. The Ushabti are in there, the bowmen are in there, obviously. The defensive stake. This implies the defensive stake rule is still there.
You're right. Yeah.
There is things to be read into this. It's not like 0 out of 10 or anything.
There's some wheat and a rat as well, which are both really obvious peasanty kind of callbacks too.
Yeah, that's all fair stuff, but we're still in like bland sort of territory. But there is a little bit of interest to it, less with the Ushabti.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's have a chat about some of the. Did you want to say something about these images that you have placed here, Bart?
This I included in this PowerPoint secretly, because this is an image of knights jousting. This is by Chris Achilleos in 1986. I forget the actual name of the painting. That's escaped me. But if I was coming out with a war game and I was having a knight faction, this is the kind of illustration I would want to be showing people about now, where we're not that far away from release. Something very vibrant and alive with some action, some excitement, maybe something arresting or something inspiring that actually helps you get excited for the game that we're supposed to be excited about. So with the artwork that they've showed, there's very little there for people who aren't like us, who aren't going to go, oh, that's an Ushabti, that's a carrion, that's a bowman. There's little to sink your teeth into, like imagination-wise. Now, I've deliberately used a non-Warhammer painting. They've got Warhammer ones, but I've deliberately used a non-Warhammer painting here to illustrate that there's some mystique that they could be injecting into the promotional material, like for their game. I think it's being very poorly promoted with what is a set of mostly, quite frankly, pretty boring images. And they don't have to be. Like, the artists who do this are fully capable of making quite exciting images, as has been done. Like some of the artwork for Warhammer Quest, that one in particular, the heroic image with the tiny warrior and the great gods. I forget the artist's name. It's a Chinese name, I think. Heavens, I can't remember it. But that's a very strong and excellent piece of art, in my opinion. So it's not a case of old art good, new art bad. And this is old. This is 1986. It's a case of what they are choosing to present. And I think we could have had a sort of a stronger and more characterful showing that suggests something of the Bretonnians, or suggests something more of the Tomb Kings and what they're like in this edition. And I don't know if it's because they're trying to tell us that nothing much is changing, although there's hints that might not be too true, or if they're just trying to be more mysterious. I think they could have done a little more. Like, I don't think a painting like this would have been out of the question at all. Something with a little bit of vibrance.
The interesting thing with this image is it seems to me is that you're also being shown, this kind of horned figure in the middle here, who is, I don't know, some kind of god of chivalry or something, who is on nobody's side, is not literally part of the image. I mean, he may be watching from afar, but he's not literally there. And so there's an implication, a sort of almost just like, being of depicting something that isn't, as I say, just literally a literal reproduction of a scene. That would be the case if you took a photograph of it, if you were standing there. And so there's that creativity there.
Yeah, it's not just the miniatures. There's a little bit of mystique. And the reason I chose a non-Warhammer image is so that you could look at it and not go, oh, that's this and that's that and that's that in Warhammer and that's that character, so that you could have a little bit of that mystique. Like for you personally, and whoever might be watching, could see this and say, I wonder who that strange and sinister knight is with the great horns. What role does he play in this conflict? And who are these knights? And there's a little bit of interest. And it's the same with the next image.
And unanswered questions as well that come. Let's go to the next image.
Very much. This one is called Aztec by Les Edwards. This is my favorite painting by Les Edwards by a long way, even more so than Hero Quest. And the reason I wanted to include this is because it's a great illustration of how you can include, or how I feel that they could have included just a suggestion maybe of what the setting is like, what this new version of Warhammer is like as compared to what we might expect. And the reason I chose this one is because this is an image that opens up to you the more you look at it. And there's a naked woman in the center. It looks like an ancient ritual, and the moon is huge in the background there. But there's details. If you look at it, you can find things start to emerge, and you learn a little bit of the setting if you pay attention. The actual painting is a little bit wider than this, but you can still see the important parts. If you look down on the bottom left there, what you can see is actually a city, a modern city. There's skyscrapers down there and everything. It's a coastal city, but the seas have receded back to nothing. And you realize that this is actually a depiction of a catastrophe that has occurred in the modern age. Basically, this other planetary body, be it the moon or whatever, is getting very close to Earth. This is based on the theories of the catastrophists, by the way. This is a painting that Les Edwards started and then stopped halfway for many years and came back and finished it. And when you read him talk about it, he says he can see parts that are done much better than other parts, and I can't see it at all. That's like the artist's eye, seeing the flaws in his own work. But this is like a depiction of a world that's completely doomed, and like a desperate return to extreme superstition to try and eke some remote chance of survival is what it looks like to me. Completely doomed. I'm going to do this ritual on top of the ziggurat that we've built in the years leading up to this disaster. The city is ruined and abandoned. The ocean is a desert. We've built this ziggurat. It reminds me of the Rainbow song, what's it called, Rising, the one where they build the Tower of Stone out of our flesh and bone to see the wizard fly. It's a song that's that reminds me of an image like this. This
Yeah,
building of this structure.
I mean, again, for me, I mean, questions, especially with you pointing out the point about the seas receding in the city, that kind of immediately spring to mind here are, I mean, is this lady doing a ritual, as you say, with an intention to attempt to prevent a catastrophe, or in acquiescence to the catastrophe? Maybe the catastrophe has become in and of itself part of the cult of her world, and maybe she's making some sort of offering of her flesh or blood to perhaps be spared when the catastrophe arrives, or maybe to ascend to some higher position in the post-catastrophe world. But all those things are mysteriously and tantalizingly implied.
The thing is, it suggests something. And I think that they could have done something like that, suggested something with an image, not necessarily like this, but an image with some meat in it, an actual scene that contains some little elements of what they've surely decided years ago by now, of the character of this new game that we're playing, either the character of the game itself or the character of the setting, and for us to mull over rather than nothing, or rather than just blandly showing us Ushabti are in, the bowmen are in. Get excited, because it's kind of hard to get excited based on what they've actually shown us. We get excited about Old World based on what we already know and what we can speculate about internally.
Also, there's a whole community of everyone who would have gone over every single image with a fine-tooth comb, and this, had an image like this been discussed, all of the possibilities that we've alluded to here and many others would have been endlessly discussed, perhaps with great fascination, by fans anticipating stuff. And that would have been fun for them.
When did they say it was coming out? Early next year.
Yeah, first quarter next year.
Practically, but that is soon, and we haven't even seen like maybe a hint of the box art, for example.
Not much. I mean, that's actually been something that, in some respects, could have maybe been a grumble had they not just released the release date the other day. I mean, it's been 4 years virtually, and we've really seen only the merest smattering of art, a few models, and for people who care about the rules, again, very little. And it's surprising how little there's been.
Compare it to other things from companies that are big like Games Workshop is these days. Like one of my favorite games ever, Dragon's Crown. Years before it came out, we'd seen the full art and all of the characters and gameplay footage. A movie, you'll see the trailer years before it comes out and you'll get a good sense of what it is. What is with this? Like the way they're promoting it and what they're releasing is strangely limited. In sort of, it's almost phantasmal, like it's almost like fading. You almost can't see it. The most we know is that it exists, and there's a couple of details. And what's frustrating is that a lot of these things would have been decided long ago. Like the box art or cover art of the initial release, whatever it is been done for a year at least now, probably.
They didn't, I mean, in a technical sense, they didn't even say that the game would be 28 millimeters until a couple of years on. I mean, really fundamental things which they must have known at launch, they've withheld, and I'm not quite sure why they did that in many cases. I don't think that's been managed very well. But there it is. Let's have a look at some of these models, Bard, as our final kind of section. And I mean, it's pretty much all Bretonnians. I'm not complaining there. And we've got here the so she's not the Fey Enchantress, but she is a named personage, a prophetess on a unicorn.
Yeah. Before we get deep into this, are they 28 really because of the scale? I guess we'll get to the scale.
They're not really 28, they're 35. That seems to me fairly obvious, at least 32, arguably 35, but they say they were on 28. That's what they say.
The classic scale is 28. The bases are bigger. The bases is a big deal. Actually, I might as well talk about that now before we get into the nitty-gritty of the models themselves. This base business. Now, you know about the base business a little more than me and the impact it can have on the game.
Oh, yes, enormous.
But to me, it seems like the same kind of move they made when the Middle-earth game started coming out. When Lord of the Rings came out, they deliberately made them a different scale to discourage you cannibalizing maybe Lord of the Rings models for your Warhammer.
Yeah.
Because they don't look right next to each other. Nobody's going to do this.
Yeah.
Well, they can't do that now because inevitably with this retroactive sort of game with old models in it, the new models are going to look silly next to the old ones. They can't get around that. So to try and block you from cross gaming. Like if you want to play your game of old and the new game of old, they've done the best they can and got a new mandatory canonically enshrined base size, because they couldn't do it with miniature scale, at least not honestly.
Yeah.
Because, man, hey, they easily could have said, and it would have been a beautiful move if they had said, look, we're going to match the older scale with our new models going forward.
Yeah.
And it's not, I doubt, actually, I don't know for sure, but I doubt it would be in any way limiting on the artistic expression of the sculptors or the skill of the sculptors. They can do magnificent work at lower scales, as is proven in many other miniature lines. There's some barbarian like Conan miniatures at 28 that you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
But here they are.
I mean, on the scale point, I mean, I was going to put this in later, but I mean, one of the scales, of course, is the horse. I mean, the horse, as you can see, or the unicorn, is self-evidently of a very different scale, but perhaps more important is the scale of the actual, humanoid creatures that are, or in this case, men or women, who are the subject of the sculpts. And this is the classic Bretonnian prophetess here, my prophetess, and she's 5 heads tall. Now, I mean, in real life, a person is probably 6.5, maybe 7 heads tall. So she's the artificially short one. And we have this recently released handmaiden, I think she's called, but basically what is analogous to a damsel being nearly 7 heads tall. And that's a very, very significant difference in head to body ratio. Now, the main issue with this is, as the Bard alluded to, these models will look odd standing next to each other. She will look very odd in a unit of peasants who are 5 heads tall, like the old prophetess was. Now, maybe you almost don't. Now, if there are some races like orcs, perhaps if your boss is just bigger than the other guys, maybe that's why he's a boss. That makes sense, but not Bretonnians. Especially maybe odd when it's I suppose, a lady kind of model who's the one, say, towering over the other kind of peasants. And that really, really irks me, this thing to do with scale. But I don't know how much other people care about it. So maybe they've managed to hit their market properly there and be able to have both old and new combined.
Well, let me tell you, I care about it. Okay, I think this matters a great deal, and it's kind of strange that they would lean so heavily into like this greater scale, pretend it's 28, and because it's even evident in their own material that they published, the pictures of their models arrayed in battle formation. It's even evident. You can see the men-at-arms are dwarfed by some of the new warriors that they've revealed recently. Yeah, it's very strange, and it's important to me because when I painted those more recent witch elves and I put them next to the old ones, they look like a completely different species. I couldn't run these in the same army because I've got old witch elves and I've got the newer ones, and they don't look right. There's a term for this that I use: clown shoes. Yeah, it makes your army look clown shoes to me. Meaning you're completely respectable, but you're wearing clown shoes, so your whole image is undermined.
Right.
Man.
Because of the change in head to body ratio. I mean, the thing is, if you read Marvel comics or something, and Superman is 10 heads tall or something, I mean, in his world, that's fine because that's the stylized choice. Now, miniatures were always designed historically with what they called heroic anatomy, which is where basically they put the head larger so you could put more detail onto it, but yet cunningly changed other proportions so they looked cool next to each other, but gave you the ability to represent character on a playing piece in a 28mm game. But that seemingly has been changed. I don't know. I think there'll be a change to dwarves, certainly, that might be even more acute, because the old sort of heroic anatomy dwarf is maybe 3 heads tall. And I think the more sort of, Gimli Lord of the Rings style dwarf, which is the Age of Sigmar one, is more analogous to be honest, to a short man. And that's more dramatic break from the past, I think.
Why I didn't like the Lord of the Rings dwarfs that much, because the ones that are actual movie characters look like actors in costume, and some of the other ones look fine for the style they were going for, but they clash with their own models a lot of the time. I found it was a little strange.
I don't see how they're going to be able to get away with this with dwarves. I think that'll look really, really bizarre. Yeah, but scale creep, man, as I say, a real kind of. They said there wouldn't be any scale creep either. Ha! What a lie that was. I knew they were fibbing about that. They can't get it out of their system to make things bigger.
They meant no new scale creep. This is completely in keeping with the last bout of scale creep we had.
Yes, exactly. They were generally, for most part, GW were relatively restrained with that scale creep thing for quite a long time. And then it kind of went off the rails. Okay, now we've got that out of our systems. I'd ask you, Bard, what you think of this prophetess, who is, I think, probably the most talked about miniature of the ones who has appeared, I think, kind of to date. I think so. Right. She's generated quite a bit of debate online, I think.
I wonder why. One of it's well, listen, I'll tell you, I like this model.
Yeah.
I think it's quite a nice looking model. I like the pose. I particularly like the way it's painted because it's very feminine and very ladylike, which is what you kind of want, which is something that's absent from a lot of Warhammer, right? Well, absent from the armies anyway. In the lore, there's all sorts of, but in the armies, it's absent. It's very distinctive, which is good. So it's even more so than the older models, at least in the way that it's painted here.
Yeah,
right. But there's the older model. It's practically a remake of sort of an amalgamation of maybe those two models there.
Yeah.
Sort of a remake of those. There's some very significant differences, though. She's much more modest, for example. There's no buxom prophetess here. Like the sexual element has been scaled back a little bit. So she's not spilling out of her top like one of them is. I guess we don't have a picture of that one.
She's not. She's also uncorseted as well.
Yeah, so she's more historically dressed is actually what I would say. But like the sexual element isn't gone; it's just been moved. Because one of the first things I noticed in comparison to these two is that she's not sitting side saddle.
Yeah,
and that's a significant move because one does not put a unicorn between a lady's legs without conjuring certain imagery. Yes. So it's subtle. There's still the sexual element, which is there correctly. By the way, because damsels and prophetesses, or what do they call them these days? Handmaidens.
Handmaidens is the latest name. Yes,
there is mention of handmaidens in the old army book. I actually remember they are
okay.
I don't know if I've got time to go around looking it up. Never mind that.
Yeah,
the handmaidens of I think either the Fey Enchantress or handmaidens of the lady herself, who are like who train or help train the young women who are captured or taken in the strange and mysterious arts.
Yes,
but I've got this book here.
Yes,
this Knights of the Grail book, and it's got a really fascinating part about damsels in it, where it speaks about sort of their position in society. I don't know if that's in like the army books at all. It might be, but listen to this passage, right? Grail damsels are completely outside the law of Bretonnia and equally outside its social customs. No one would dare criticize one, even behind her back. They are all beautiful, appearing young for many years, before suddenly withdrawing to the forest of Lorraine, where most assume that they die. Many go about with their hair uncovered, and not a few are notorious for their promiscuity, though no tales of a Grail damsel giving birth are known. And it goes on to say that no one's really sure why they do anything that they do, but they can't be questioned. They're a little bit like druids in that sense.
Yes.
So they're loose in society, and there's sort of an untamed sort of sexual element to them, which might be quite threatening to certain elements of Bretonnian society. But these older models wore that a little bit more on their sleeve than the new ones. So, yeah, but it's still there. They're not buxom like they used to be. They're more moderately garbed. And I quite like the other one as well, like the other damsel.
Yeah.
Their problem with that is she's floating, which is a little too much.
Yeah, I don't think that's for elves, perhaps, but for
yeah, that's more of an elf affectation. If only she was on the ground, because she's a remake of an older model as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Bretonnian lore in the army book certainly does talk about them acting as kind of advisors and things to, dukes. And so there is, I think, the implication that they are kind of seen at court, shall we say, and have got that a certain kind of status there. So it's not as though they're completely out of that and just leave sort of, the kind of the politics to the dukes. So and I think with the Morgana Le Fay, who is the figure there on the center, she's much more medieval in her in her kind of look. I mean, I don't think you can even see the hair on the model, for example, at all. No, so there isn't really that feeling of, even though she is actually depicted in the forest in a very, very famous image, she's not quite, as almost like semi, I don't know, sort of sylph-like kind of. You couldn't see her emerging from the lake with her kind of immaculately, prepared, head, sort of head kind of attire and her corsetry. Whereas the one on the left there, that's much more, a bit more sort of mysterious and foresty. Looks a bit more elf-like as well. Maybe they had that in mind when they told us she was an elf later.
Mm-hmm. But no, I'm not down on the new model. Obviously, it's a scale thing. It's going to look extraordinarily strange next to the old ones. I'd like to see them side by side in actuality, just to see the difference. Because physically, like you said before, she is of a significantly different scale, right? It doesn't look like it's the same world. Doesn't look like it's the same line of models. Different game completely, probably, is what it looks like.
I mean, to me, it almost looked a little bit, and I do think I agree with you. I quite like this model because it's not too over the top in the sense that it's obvious what it is by looking at it. From 20 feet away, tested with a team of Russian ex-Soviet scientists and all the rest of it, to coin a classic phrase.
Of course.
You know what they are. That bit's good. When I looked at it, I thought I'd like to own this model and I'd like to paint it. And as I say, it is a nice depiction of, as I say, a feminine kind of model from the range of Warhammer fans, of which there have not been maybe so very many. And I'd like to put it on my shelf and leave it there along with my other kind of figurine statues. Putting it into battle, alongside my other stuff, well, that was a little bit more doubtful.
Your other stuff, maybe not, but someone else's army.
Someone else's other stuff.
Built around this. Like, this is the sort of model where I could see myself having it and making an army around that model. Like this is what I usually do. It's the way it's posed, it's not over the top. There's nothing over the top about it. Like I said, that it's almost historical with this style of dress and the belt. There's a proper name for that style of belt. I don't know it, but it's a beautiful traditional medieval style of look. And the way it's posed is it's posed and looked is befitting of a champion model in an army.
I completely agree with that. The issue is just simply that one can't make it backwardsly compatible. And of course, we are being asked, of course, because we're not having models for a lot of the other kind of stuff. Presumably, she is going to be riding in the lot. She's not going to fit in the second rank anymore because the base would be too big. But on one side of the second rank of a unit of Knights of the Realm, towering above them, and that's going to look weird. No question.
But it might not look too weird when they get around to releasing the new Knights of the Realm.
If they, if once they get around to doing that. I mean, we have some. This is another one they revealed the other day. This sort of Lord on Pegasus. I mean, again, the Pegasus's head is very small compared to what it used to be, and its wingspan is, well, I mean, really very considerable for a Pegasus, because a Pegasus was always canonically not meant to be a very great monster. It just sort of has, a couple of attacks, and it's not really, it's not like a hippogriff, which is, genuinely a formidable force, and like maybe equal to its rider in its own way. But this Pegasus is much more formidable.
It's a befitting mount for a heroic figure.
Not for, I think, regular Pegasus Knights.
No, this is a hero's mount.
Yes.
I don't know how it scales. I don't know how it scales with regular Pegasus. They did actually picture some Pegasus Knights on their reveal, didn't they?
They did. They're the regular, the 6th ed ones on slightly bigger bases.
Do they stand out? They're like a what did I call it? A shock of relief against the black and red monotony of the rest of the line, because they're very personally colored heraldic colors and patterns and what have you. They look really beautiful. This one actually does as well on the right there with its, its nice coloration. That's an example of not sticking to the, the house order, I think we might say, for coloration.
Yeah,
and it looks quite good. Like, this isn't even a bad model. It's not
I think
over the top. I'm a
Yeah,
great
no, I
fan
think
of, I'm a great fan of candy striped lancers.
yes,
Got
yes,
that going.
yes. It's if one can look past the scale, I think that's the main thing. We've got these were a couple. The scale issue with this battle standard bearer when it came out, this was one of the first sort of things, I suppose, that alerted me to this when I looked at I suppose, an ordinary Games Workshop plastic horse, or heaven forfend, a plastic horse from this kind of an era, which is an 80s wood elf horse, which is really small. But this horse, he's a big fellow, isn't he? Probably one could argue much more realistically proportioned vis-a-vis the kind of stallion that could transport a fully armored knight, but just not consistent with what once was.
This knight, he looks, the one riding, I mean, he looks proportionate to the knight from the artwork before that I didn't like that much. Mounted. He looks like, that makes me think maybe the model itself might have been direct reference for that painting, or this model or one like it, because the way the legs are proportioned, it looks like something like the heroic scale that they have here.
Yeah, definitely. His legs don't reach very far, do they? That seems, it may well be an interesting scale call.
Maybe I've been unkind to that other model as well. I'd have to see. I haven't spent much time looking at it, so I don't want to be too judgmental.
Yeah.
But this is a model I do like. I enjoy some of the details. It's not too extravagant. The banner sits quite nicely, which is something that is a problem sometimes. Let's hope they rank up well, because that was one of the banes. I don't want to go off on a
ranking stuff up. Well, that's something, the reason why they were changing the bases, to help them kind of rank up better.
Yeah, but they've already ruined it. They've already taken up the extra space with the model scale,
with a mega thing. Yeah. If you were doing what they said they would do, which is change the base sizes but keep the scale, then you would have got that. But obviously they didn't.
Maybe you'd be able to have 2 ranks of Cold One Knights then.
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't just
wanted to have Cold One Knights once upon a time. You cannot have a rear rank. You have to know. This is such a trap for inexperienced or unaware people. You have to know that you can't have a second rank of Cold One Knights if you build them normally. You have to know to put them slightly off center so that the tails will go like one side of the nose of the Cold One Knight behind. So you have to put the one in the front on that extreme side of the base, the one in the back on that extreme side of the base. And if you look at the material that they always published, there's never 2 ranks of Cold One Knights. There's always just 1 rank secretly.
Well, there you go.
You can spot all the manipulations that they used to do. Like when they brought out the new witch elves, the way they're posed, you can't rank those up unless but to get mine to rank up, I had to do an extreme amount of pre-planning because I saw this coming.
Yeah.
I had to get them, assemble them, and then I had to stencil where their footprint was on the thing and fix them with blue tack just to see if they'd rank up. And even now, the whole unit only fits one exact way, like a jigsaw puzzle. They almost have to be numbered so you can put them back in the right order so that they actually fit.
Yes.
And they can't engage with another unit frontally. The bases will never touch.
Yeah, and GW weren't in the interest of selling puzzles to people. Rank up your witch elves. That's paint them and then rank them up and then make the correct order.
Some of the photos of them as well in battle. Some are secretly bent a certain way. Some are leaning a little further forward than they actually do naturally. So they've had to do secret shenanigans to get them to rank up.
They've had to be clever with all these kind of things. I remember when the 4th Ed Skaven, we just had this little choppy sword. They were presented for a while on another kind of slaughter base, which turned them from diagonal to straight. And then when you assembled them, all of them were simply stabbing each other in the back, which is a very Skaven-y thing to do, but not really very conducive to creating any functional formation.
Yeah, there was another. I don't remember the line of miniatures, but it was like Dwarf Rangers, and they had snares, but I was absolutely blown away because I opened it and there's the instructions for assembly and it says, okay, now watch out because they have trouble ranking up if you do this. So this is what they warned you. Games Workshop would never do that.
Yeah, no.
They're more got your money. Now get out of here.
Get out of here, exactly.
Maybe.
Yeah.
There's an uncharitable view.
Yeah. So now we've got so these are foot knights, and there are two different kinds of these. These were both revealed the other day. One of them has these sort of great weapons, and the other has sword and board. Now, foot knights, for a bit of historical callback, apart from being a specific virtue that you could buy in the sixth ed book with the virtue of empathy, foot knights only existed in third ed when Bretonnians were essentially feudal era France. So they do have some kind of pedigree, and now they've kind of reappeared, and they're quite I mean, it's nice to see a ranked up unit of the new stuff, which is, I think, the first time we've actually kind of seen this. They're quite, personally, I prefer these axe ones a little bit more. I think there's a little bit more predictability of the pose. They are a little bit too complicated for my taste, but I appreciate that this is kind of my tastes. And what seems odd to me is that we've got this uniform heraldry, as we've complained about before, and yet the tops of their helmets are extremely individual. That seems to be a bit inconsistent.
It may be, but you've got to remember that according to what they said, they wear the heraldry of the Lord, but they are still individual knights, so they would still have their own herald. I actually like that they're all individually helmeted with some quite traditional ones. There's the boar impaled in the back there.
Yes, an old symbol.
Sort of,
yes,
quite good. I still don't like them. Hey, and it hasn't got anything to do with the quality of the models, although they are a little bit modern and complicated for me. And I would prefer a banner rather than the icon. The icon reminds me a little bit too much of the 40K sort of thing. They're big on the icon bearers in the Sisters of Battle, I think, which is a comparable thing. The reason I don't like them is purely thematic. It's just because I favor the 6th edition Bretonnian because I know it so much better, I guess. It clashes a little with the central idea, like I said, with the Wood Elves before.
Yeah.
And the unit of foot knights somehow takes away a little bit of the lordly mounted knight idea, separate from the rabble of his army. These are down in the rabble. This could be an indication that we're heading back toward maybe a little bit of the old Stillman flavor, perhaps.
Maybe.
Or at least ancient age Bretonnians, maybe.
They're all getting the virtue of empathy. I mean, I agree. I mean, of course, they had mounted yeomen before, and a lot in the fluff of the mounted yeomen, or the mounted squires as they were called, much was made of the fact that they were a favoured kind of peasant, and they were allowed to ride a horse. And that horse in 5th ed was one of those kind of horses that wasn't allowed to attack, because it wasn't a war horse. And so they only got that very reluctantly. And now the knights are all into this going around on foot business.
Mm-hmm. I will criticize one thing. I don't like the poses they're in. I've kind of gone it all depends on the unit, but I don't much like units that have striding forward into battle poses or leaping forward into battle poses. I much prefer them to seem a little bit more at the ready, because most of the time your unit, your army is not going to be in battle. You're going to be viewing them ranked up, and they look much better that way when they're at the ready. And when they're on the tabletop fighting another army, you're not really looking at them. So it doesn't, not in detail anyway.
No.
So the pose of lunging forward or striding forward is a little bit wasted. And the pose they're in with the great weapons in particular reminds me, it's like the very same pose that I think Dark Elf Executioners have. And, and maybe the Wildwood Rangers have, but it's very reminiscent of something else. And it's like, maybe they could have done something a little more characterful, maybe with these. I do like the weapons. I love those axes and the great swords and what have you. I think they're extravagant in a very Warhammery kind of way. Yeah. You know, a very sort of extreme fantasy kind of weapon, but not too extreme.
And they look also, I think, expensive as well, which is nice.
Yes.
So they look as though the peasants couldn't have them.
Definitely. These are lordly figures, short of being an elf, which is the ultimate lordly thing to be. These are clearly knights. But still, I'd prefer not to have them. This seems like it's in danger of veering toward rules before idea, which is kind of what I was moaning about before. Maybe not, because there is precedence. Like I said, there's precedence for these things.
Yeah.
But, you know, it all depends how it plays out. And when we get a more complete view of what the army is like and its character and what this new vision of Warhammer is like, then maybe we'll have more or less to complain about.
Yes, maybe more or less. I mean, and that's the thing, and those are really the models, really, and so I do. There still feels, even now, even though the release date, and perhaps maybe this is something perhaps to maybe even conclude on, is that despite release being as little as 3 months away, I still feel as though we know so very little about what it is that we're being asked to buy. I mean, maybe that will be very exciting. There will just be this huge boom, and it will just all be really, really fantastic, and we'll be literally, I don't know, in transports of delight. And even some gnarled, cynical old so-and-so like me, who's probably not bought anything before 1995, will be running to the shop to go and buy his Foot Knights, and because he understands the ideas that have animated them. But maybe not. I doubt it, in fact, I might say, skeptically.
Well, the die is cast. I'll say that, because whatever we say now, whatever anyone else says, whatever decisions for the next year or two have been made, there's no altering the course of the old world at the moment, right? So all we can do is read what we can and what we can see, and that's about it.
And there's been no ability to alter that course since it was even announced, really, because there have been so few or so thin updates that public opinion, if you want to call it that, hasn't had much of a chance, I would think, to shape the game. It's been under quite, tight kind of wraps. And so I guess let's just hope they got it right, I suppose.
Hope so.
Proof of pudding will be in the eating there. Well, Bard, I think we probably reached the end of what was an epic session of bardic proportions in terms of its muscularity.
Was it? Good.
Excellent, precisely. And yes, it was really fascinating. And thank you very much again for coming on the Dr. Blacksill kind of channel. And I feel, in fact, I'm a little slightly more optimistic, actually, after our grumble than I did before. Which
really?
Yes, I think so. Slightly more optimistic, but then my expectations coming in were very, very low. So maybe you've helped alleviate not some of my concerns, but maybe optimistic about certain things, or perhaps given me a better kind of, or a slightly more optimistic frame of reference for looking at things, or a new lens to see it through, which makes me a little bit less depressed than before. Let's see if that lasts.
We shall see.
All right, Bard, farewell in your land, and tally-ho.
Yes. I have secret matters to attend to in these realms, much to ponder also.
Indeed, much to be said and much to be seen. Farewell.
Farewell.